So, this kid is named Ghislain, the eldest son of the Pertium family, some nobles who were basically broke. The maids and everyone in the house are super scared of him, and honestly, with good reason. He's known as this cursed guy with a horrible, despicable personality. One day, the rejection from everyone got so bad that Ghislain left the family before he could get kicked out. He became a mercenary, and over the years, he built a crazy reputation. He became so powerful that he was known as one of the 7 greats of the continent. As an adult, Ghislain realized he used to be trash and that his family was right, so he went back to his kingdom to ask for forgiveness. But guess what he found there? His whole family and kingdom had been destroyed by a betrayal. A long time later, after a huge war between kingdoms finally ended, Ghislain was defeated in a massive battle. The noble swordsman Eden told Ghislain the war was over. When asked for his last words, he simply said he regretted never getting his revenge, and in the end, Eden wished him death. The boy chuckled and said, "Ghislain, you're far too arrogant." Suddenly, Eden asked Ghislain about the boy who abandoned his family after his sister's death. Ghislain simply asked Eden how he knew that. Eden admitted he was exhausted from trying to dig up Ghislain's past, and he confessed they were working in collusion with the Dolphin family to bring down the Pertium family. Hearing this, Ghislain was utterly shocked. He was stunned to realize it wasn't just the Dolphin family behind the incident. Eden deemed the conversation pointless, as Ghislain would die soon anyway. The result was that Ghislain had never been so furious in his entire life. And right there, Edom defeated Ghislain, the mercenary king. But instead of dying, Ghislain's body felt weird. He was young again, and he saw all his past memories flashing by, especially of his sister who died young back when he was a useless rebel. Then, Ghislain woke up in a room. Looking at his hand, he was sure he had just died. His body felt like it was going to explode with pain, so he actually thought it would have been better to stay dead. Just then, the door swung open and someone walked in. The maid was overjoyed to see that he had regained consciousness. When Ghislain saw Belinda, he froze in shock. She told him she had been worried sick and that he should have left the orcs to the soldiers, but he cut her off by rushing over and hugging her tightly. Surprised, she asked if she had done something wrong. Belinda was Ghislain's personal tutor and the only one who put up with his antics until the very end. But after his family's fall, she vanished and he never saw her again. She couldn't understand why he was so happy to see her, since they saw each other every day. Ghislain felt he had to tell her the truth. He seriously warned her that a disaster would soon strike the mansion, leaving her stunned. But he also wanted to tell her the most important thing. Ghislain told her he had returned to life after dying, and Belinda agreed that he had taken a heavy blow from the orcs. She then asked if he knew the disaster would fall on him, not the mansion. She began scolding him for being reckless, but he wasn't surprised. Belinda asked what would happen if he couldn't even attend the festival because of his injuries. Hearing this, he froze. Belinda reminded him that Helena was looking forward to the day Ghislain would take her to the festival. The maid saw this as a good chance for them to get close again. Ghislain then remembered a festival held around this time of year. In the past, because of everything happening, he hadn't been able to enjoy it with her. When he asked when the festival would be, she replied it was in about a week. That got him thinking. Suddenly, someone else entered the room. Turning toward the familiar voice, Ghislain felt confused. All his life, he had been haunted by memories he couldn't escape, and in 1 week, his sister was supposed to die. Seeing her, Ghislain ran and hugged her tightly. Belinda watched in shock. Helena was also taken aback, thinking her brother was playing some kind of prank. But Ghislain just told her how much he had missed her. The girl pushed him away firmly, saying he was creeping her out. Feeling the pain, Ghislain wondered if she had always been this strong. Sighing, Helena said this wouldn't change what had happened between them. Ghislain didn't get what she meant at first. It turned out he had said some pretty nasty things to her recently, and Helena was still hurting from it. Ghislain was surprised. They hadn't been close in the past. Realizing he was in the wrong, he apologized. Stunned, the girls thought his behavior was just a result of the clash with the orcs, but Ghislain insisted he was the one who defeated them, not the other way around. His shouting was cut short by a sharp pain shooting through his body. Watching him, Helena remarked that was probably why he had been dragged back to the mansion unconscious. The girls then shared a hearty laugh. For a moment, Ghislain just watched them quietly. Then he smiled, because the people in front of him were exactly as he remembered. In the past, he had refused to go to the festival, using a failed trip as an excuse. That was the last time he saw his sister. Later, she was tragically lost along with her bodyguards. Ghislain blamed himself for not being there with her. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. 2 guards appeared looking for Helena. They apologized for the intrusion and explained that the staff needed her to oversee the festival preparations. Ghislain asked why they were asking Helena to do that. Belinda explained that because they were short-staffed, even Helena had to help out sometimes. Looking at his sister, he realized that in the past, he simply hadn't cared enough to notice. Suddenly, he offered his help. Hearing this, Helena spun around, surprised. The girls were once again convinced Ghislain had taken a serious blow to the head. When they left, It was incredibly noisy. Helena refused Ghislaine's help because no one wanted to work with him around. Ghislaine figured Helena's body would be found far from the festival, meaning someone had dragged her there. To prevent that, he needed to find all the castle's entrances and exits. Suddenly, he heard someone's voice approaching. When Ghislaine saw the man, he recognized him instantly. Standing before him was an old, panting man, Fergus. The old man said he came right away as soon as he heard what happened to the detachment. Helena said Ghislaine was acting weird, so Fergus should have taken the boy back. Ghislaine had to resign himself to the fact that he'd need to gather information slowly. Afterward, he asked the old man to take him to an abandoned training ground. When asked why, the young man calmly replied he was going to train. Fergus was surprised to hear that. When he took the boy to the right spot, Ghislaine was stunned. Turns out the place was even better than he'd imagined. It was a perfect spot for his training, one he hadn't found in all his years as a mercenary. The old man said they'd been monitoring the preparations for the place because Fergus was sure Ghislaine's difficulties would resolve themselves with time. Suddenly, Ghislaine realized Fergus had been just like this in his past life. Thinking about it, the young man grew depressed. He replied that he wanted to live a long life and that death wasn't for him, which made Fergus feel as if the boy had already experienced death. Ghislaine sarcastically shot back that he had indeed died and been reborn. When Fergus thought it was a joke, Ghislaine bid him farewell. Ghislaine reflected on how he'd always been hostile to those around him, but in reality, he was simply blind. But now he knew he had 1 week before everything started to fall apart. They discovered that one of the neighboring feudal lords was behind Helena's death, and because of that, Pertium got embroiled in a war it lost. Ghislaine knew Helena's death was the starting point for everything. That's why he decided to start fixing it. He decided to start by taking care of his own body, even without much time. But even so, Ghislaine intended to open the path of mana. Mana was a supernatural force that allowed people to push past their limits. Releasing and accumulating mana was considered a tough task, but Ghislaine could do it even in the thick of battle. All he needed to do was feel the mana particles and gather them in one place. For a man who had fought in tens of thousands of battles, creating a mana core was easy. But that wasn't the only thing that allowed Ghislaine to become one of the strongest. It was also thanks to the method he read about in the book he found. And because of that, the guy managed to create multiple mana cores. And all three were interconnected. This could have helped him regain lost strength, but Ghislaine's body couldn't handle the strain. In his past life, he could create 5 cores, but right now, he could only manage 3. This method allowed for rapid strength development, but in return, it demanded a huge amount of mana. This was the main reason for Ghislaine's defeat against Eden, as he was attacked when his mana was depleted. The technique wasn't the most reliable, but for now, it would be enough for Ghislaine. And since he was young and had plenty of free time, he was determined to chop off Idun's head and also deal with the Dolphin family and their goons. Ghislaine was going to destroy them all. A week later, a festival took place, and Ghislaine showed up armed. Helena was surprised to see him. She found it odd that her brother had come to an event like that for the first time, but he had to go since he was a family representative. Helena noticed he had changed and already knew he'd been training all week. The young man asked what was wrong with the family heir training, and Helena reminded him he'd said the exact opposite earlier. Ghislaine was taken aback when she mentioned he wanted to become a lord without ceremony. With a smile, Helena went on to say that her brother's changes only made her happy. It even seemed to her that the old Ghislaine had returned. Hearing this, the young man was surprised and fell silent. He'd actually figured something out this week. Because of the changes in his behavior, the present and future had also started to shift. Major events were unlikely to change, but he couldn't predict how his actions would affect the smaller ones. He was forced to use his knowledge of the future and devise the most effective plan for each situation. He also braced himself for what was about to go down. He spent the entire night walking with Helena as she sampled street food. Most of the time, he just went wherever his sister dragged him. Helena loved everything, even though after so many years, the festival had started to get boring. However, Ghislaine thought nothing bad had happened yet, even though the festival was almost over. Suddenly, he heard voices. The arriving knights said a new kind of entertainment had popped up not far from there. Helena agreed to go, hoping it would be fun, and in that moment, Ghislaine realized who was behind it all. It turned out his family had been harboring snakes. Philip and Jamal enjoyed unconditional trust, as they'd protected Helena since birth. Soon, the knights led Helena to the spot they'd mentioned, but it turned out there was absolutely nothing there. Helena was surprised to see how anyone could have fun in such a miserable place. Jamal asked them to wait, promising everyone would arrive soon. But Helena was indignant at the idea of no one showing up in a place like that. Paying almost no attention to them, Ghislaine was lost in his own thoughts. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary alley, but there were blockades, cutting off escape routes. The boy's thoughts were interrupted by his sister's sudden voice. Jamal asked Helena to wait, but she grabbed Ghislaine and was about to leave. Then her brother was outraged by his sister's strength. Since Helena was looking at Ghislaine, she didn't notice someone blocking her path and bumped into him. Philip asked Helena to wait a little longer, but seeing his strangely abnormal face, the girl got scared. So she told the knights they were weird and asked what was wrong with them. Then Jamal told her they didn't intend to scare her, and then he went on to say they simply had a request. Hearing that, Helena started to feel afraid. At that instant, another person appeared ahead. He arrived accompanied by two other people whose faces were hidden. When Frank arrived, he said the job was clean, as expected. Jamal said they'd done what was necessary, so it was worth sealing the deal. But at that moment, Frank turned his attention to the boy next to Helena. He recognized Ghislaine immediately and said he hadn't hired that guy. Jamal said Ghislaine was an added bonus, as he'd come along with them. Then Ghislaine cut into the conversation and asked Jamal why he thought he could trade them so easily. The knight advised Ghislaine to worry about himself, as they would simply make a run for it. Then he admitted they were already tired of these poor lands. Besides, he knew everyone was fleeing those lands. Ghislaine got sick of hearing the traitor and decided to jump into battle, taking advantage of the element of surprise. As blood gushed from his mouth and wound, Jamal merely let out a choked cough. Everyone else was stunned by the unexpected attack. As the traitor's body split in two, Ghislaine said that at least the others hadn't bargained with other people's lives, and then he turned to Philip. Terrified, the knight grabbed Helena and prepared to draw his weapon, but right in front of him, Ghislaine launched the first attack, killing the enemy instantly. Before he died, all he could gasp out was that it was unthinkable. His lifeless body then slumped to the ground. The other bandits started muttering about how the eldest son of the Pertium family had never even trained, but their leader was dead certain it was Ghislaine standing right there. The two knights were distracted, but even then, the guy's attacks were absolutely stunning. Helena, trembling with fear, demanded to know what was going on, but Ghislaine didn't even bother to answer his sister. With one swift, brutal move, he simply knocked his sister out cold. He scooped her up and gently laid her down on the ground. When they thanked him for doing their dirty work, Ghislaine finally turned. The man said they wanted to get rid of the knights regardless, adding that Ghislaine was nothing like the rumors. The bandit then suggested Ghislaine was deliberately hiding his true skills. Ghislaine drew his sword and asked what any of that had to do with them. Gripping his sword, he mentally noted there were only 3 opponents left. The 2 behind him posed no real threat, but the leader himself was radiating immense mana. Because of this, Ghislaine decided it was best to deal with him swiftly. Before that, he demanded to know who gave the order, but the thief just sneered that the dead didn't need to know. Ghislaine wasn't surprised by his answer at all, but after that, he was absolutely determined to make the thief spill everything. The man then ordered his men to capture the boy alive, but to break his limbs, ensuring he'd go mad with utter helplessness. With a chilling smile, the man declared that to forge a true masterpiece, one must first learn a lesson through pain. As soon as they got the order, the 2 thieves lunged forward fast, but before them, Ghislaine remained eerily calm, moving with incredible agility. As the thieves charged, he hurled an object right at them. The thief immediately recognized the firecracker, but as he stared at it, he was slammed in the face. After slicing through the firecracker, Ghislaine plunged his sword deep into the thief's face. Meanwhile, another thug closed in on the young man from the other side. He tried to strike, but Ghislaine expertly blocked the blow. The moment the sword stopped, Ghislaine twisted his arm and snatched the blade, so he turned and took her away. In that exact moment, he brandished his own sword and cut off the thief's head. As he carried out the attack, he heard a whistle coming from above. When his men were eliminated, their leader decided to intervene in the fight, but reacting to his approach, Ghislaine blocked the blow again. The man didn't understand how the other guy could block the blow if they were approaching him from a blind spot. Turning around, Ghislaine prepared to attack. Due to his own confusion, the man didn't see the attack, which hit him in the neck. He had a cut on his neck, and his pipe was also cut in half, but the man's sword continued to move. Reacting to the danger, the young man blocked the blow. Then the man recognized Ghislaine's strength, because if he didn't have mana, he would have already lost his head. Ghislaine supposed the man must have concentrated his mana around him to avoid serious damage. The thief had no idea where the kid had gotten such skills at such a young age, but he promised him that Ghislaine would die there. In that instant, mana began to glow around the man. As he attacked, he said that with Ghislaine's scarce mana reserves, he wouldn't be able to win, and with excitement in his eyes, he anticipated how he would kill the guy. But as soon as he said that, a smile lit up Ghislaine's face. Upon realizing this, the man was surprised. In that instant, the young man dodged and deflected the enemy's sword, and taking advantage of the enemy's confusion, he delivered a kick. After receiving the blow, the thief jumped back several meters. Despite all that, he just remembered that, with his mana reserves, Ghislaine wouldn't win. However, as soon as he finished speaking, blood gushed gushed from his throat. Due to the intense pain, the man fell to his knees and began to cough. The boy's blow wasn't strong, but the man presumed Ghislain had broken his enchantment. As he approached the man, Ghislain said he had never imagined there was a conspiracy behind his sister's death, and now he was furious to find out who was behind it. Ghislain was ready to kill the man right then and there. Feeling an unexpected surge of mana, the thief was completely taken aback. But his thoughts were cut short when the young man suddenly charged at him. The man had to admit his opponent was fast. Still, he managed to defend against Ghislain's relentless attacks, and the fight raged on. Then, Ghislain unleashed a devastating blow. With all his might, he slammed both his swords down onto the thief's blade. The man's hands were trembling, even though he was just blocking the attacks. His sword began to slowly crack. He'd never seen anyone unleash mana in such massive quantities before. It was like Ghislain had suddenly transformed into a completely different person. With one more strike, Ghislain shattered the man's sword completely. The attack was no longer blocked, and the thief took a mortal wound. Blood immediately gushed from the massive wound. But that wasn't enough for Ghislain. He prepared to strike again. Then, he plunged his sword into the now defenseless thief. The man screamed in intense pain from the wounds piercing his body, but Ghislain just pressed his hand against the thief's throat and shoved him back. Then, he calmly invited the man to continue their conversation. Without even flinching, Ghislain demanded to know who had ordered this attack. But the thief refused to give up so easily and pulled out a hidden knife. His real target, it turned out, was Ghislain, not the defenseless, sleeping Helena. He decided he'd at least take Ghislain down with him, but just as he tried to throw the dagger, his hand froze. Trapping the man with a spell, Ghislain offered him a deal. Ghislain promised to sheathe his sword if the man stopped doing stupid things and just answered his questions. The thief immediately realized the threads were made of mana, but he had no idea when Ghislain had conjured them. Turns out, Ghislain had been preparing this spell all along. Clutching his sword, the thief taunted Ghislain, saying a warrior like him could surely heal his wounds. But the young man knew that everything would end if his mana core was destroyed. Hearing that, the thief instantly tensed up. A searing pain ripped through him, and a massive crack began to spiderweb across his body. What truly terrified him was his mana, rapidly dissipating. The man warned that one wrong move, and that mana would obliterate everything in its path. Ghislain scoffed, declaring only amateurs would die, but he would find a way. The man instantly knew Ghislain wasn't bluffing. Staring into those eyes, he saw his own death staring back. Terrified, he betrayed the Count, the very man who'd ordered Helena's execution. He revealed this was Count Desmond's twisted plan to ignite a war. Ghislain, however, remained utterly unfazed. In a past life, all the dirty work had always been dumped on the Duke's allied families. Ghislain asked if that was why they needed Helena, and the man confirmed it. But as he did, the man plunged the sword even deeper. Coughing, the man choked out, demanding to know why Ghislain had broken their agreement. Ghislain let out a low, chilling chuckle, remarking that the thief had killed many, but now, facing death, he'd become a coward himself. But the man was utterly shocked to hear laughter in response. He insisted his death wouldn't change a thing, and the Degrad's issue was already settled. But Ghislain forcibly silenced the thief, then decided to explain something. The guy chuckled, claiming he'd been reborn after death, and this time, everything would be different. The moment he finished speaking, he made the man feel intense pain once more. Just as he'd said, the mana erupted, but Ghislain stood completely unharmed. Gasping for breath, Ghislain turned his head. There he saw Helena, deeply asleep on the floor. Tossing the sword aside, the man leaned his head back and let out a heavy sigh. But in that very instant, he felt blood surge up his throat. Ghislain collapsed to his knees and vomited. He cursed. His strength had never caused such a reaction before. Staring at the door ahead, he vowed he wouldn't give up so easily, no matter what. Bursting in, he was met with a pogrom and yet another body. Ghislain went straight for it, knowing that body existed, and if the thief's words held any truth, Ghislain knew exactly whose body it was. Lying before him was the son of Degrad. After examining the bodies, the man concluded they had all been murdered and framed as Helena's killers. However, as soon as the deaths of these people were revealed, war would break out. So Ghislain decided to get rid of the evidence. After setting the building ablaze, Ghislain grabbed his sister and left. However, as they were leaving, someone was watching them, and immediately, that man decided to report everything. Soon enough, everyone realized the mission had failed. The thieves were showered with insults, but the spy tried to justify himself. He explained that Ghislaine himself had prevented Helena from being killed. Hearing that name, everyone thought of the guy as a useless idiot. Suddenly, someone said everyone knows what Ghislaine is like, so that argument held no water. The spy objected, saying the guy was nothing like what they said about him. The rumors were completely different from reality, but the spy suspected there was someone else in the boy's body. He immediately changed the subject, talking about Degrad, and said it wouldn't be hard to start a territorial war now. The spy begged for another chance, but everyone considered him helpless and decided to get rid of him. Suddenly, an imposing voice interrupted everyone. The man asked what kind of chance the thief needed. Then he promised he'd get rid of Ghislaine. He said he'd personally fight the guy because he had an ace up his sleeve. Hearing that, everyone was involuntarily intrigued, and they were talking about Cain Lodges, who was famous for his fencing techniques. And since Cain was Ghislaine's cousin, it wouldn't be hard to pit the two against each other. Hearing that, everyone was surprised but remained silent. Only the one with the greatest power decided to speak. The man warned that if the thief failed again, there wouldn't be a next chance. Upon arriving at the training center, Fergus wanted to invite the young man to lunch. But suddenly, the old man saw a brilliant light before him. A sudden light appeared, engulfing the sword that was leaning against the wall, and then he began to carry the sword into the training hall. Ghislaine effortlessly intercepted the sword. He gave it a few swings, concluding it wasn't half bad. Just then, he realized someone had entered the room. Fergus apologized to the young man for interrupting his training. But then, out of nowhere, he asked Ghislaine how the boy had pulled that off. After asking exactly what Fergus was talking about, Ghislaine demonstrated his skill once more. He explained that mana threads let him use mana as a pulling force. He'd used it many times before, but now he needed to use all his strength to manipulate the threads. But if Ghislaine used just one thread and conserved mana, he could achieve the same level. Fergus admitted he thought he knew a lot about mana training, but he'd never seen anything like that. He mused on how Ghislaine hadn't used mana recently, yet now found such incredible uses for it. But then he remembered he had something important to tell Ghislaine. Fergus bowed deeply and thanked the young man for saving Helena. But Ghislaine brushed it off, saying he just did what he had to do. Helena admitted that no one believed her when she said Ghislaine had saved her, so she asked her brother to tell everyone, but he flat out refused. Belinda was furious about what the two knights had done, but she'd found them strange from the start anyway. Ghislaine knew Helena was keeping a lot of things under wraps, but he was satisfied that he had at least postponed the war for a while. Ghislaine couldn't stop them alone. He needed an army. Just then, a maid entered the room bringing food. Meanwhile, Ghislaine mused that to get an army, he'd need more power, but his thoughts were cut short when a piece of bread was placed right in front of him. At first, Ghislaine just stared at the piece of bread. Then, he decided to ask Belinda if they were really serving dessert right away, but the girl reminded him that their region was poor. Just then, a loud voice was heard, demanding compensation. A man in the street was demanding compensation for the damages caused by the festival's cancellation. However, he wasn't alone. A whole crowd of disgruntled people stood behind him. People were furious, convinced the Count's family was rolling in cash. Ghislaine peered out the window, utterly horrified by the unfolding chaos. Belinda confessed she knew it would all come to this. She added that many merchants in their land relied on these festivals, having made a fortune last year. The festival was being shut down after just one day, and the merchants were absolutely furious. Ghislaine was aghast at the gravity of the situation. He realized that if he left things as they were, the situation would only spiral further. He then commanded Fergus and the soldiers to calm the raging crowd. The old man replied with a smile, stating there were no soldiers left. He had to explain that most of the soldiers had ventured deep into the forest to eliminate the orcs. Initially, their lands were constantly plagued by wars due to relentless invader attacks. And on the other side, a monster-infested forest. Ghislaine was livid. They had neither soldiers nor money. He then told Belinda they needed to talk. He argued that since Belinda was in charge of his funds, she should have used them to appease the merchants, but the girl simply stated the money wasn't there. With a smirk, she reminded him that the Count had forbidden Ghislaine from giving out money, as he'd spent it recklessly before. After a moment of stunned reflection, Ghislaine realized this meant he was utterly broke. He then tried to borrow some from Belinda, but she had no money either. After a meager dinner, Ghislaine sat in his room, pondering how they truly had nothing left to lose. At this rate, even with his knowledge of the future, he was utterly helpless. As he pondered, someone rushed towards him. A knight burst into the room, letting out a piercing scream. Ghislaine dropped from the window ledge, demanding to know what was happening. Ricardo blurted out they had a problem. Cain wanted to see Ghislaine. At the mention of that name, Ghislaine's eyes widened slightly. Until Ghislaine's arrival, their guards had barely been managing the situation. Skovan bore the brunt of all the rage. From the brutal assault, Cain's hands were completely stained with the man's blood, but ignoring it completely, he continued to mercilessly beat the knight. The force of the blow was so powerful, it crushed Skovan's armor. Skovan was already pretty battered when Ghislaine arrived on the scene. Seeing the young man, Skovan trembled, whether from joy or pain, but the boy was stunned by what Cain had done to the knight. Hearing the voice, the boy tore his gaze away from Skovan. Then he saw Cain, who was way bigger than him. Looking down at the young man, Cain greeted him. Ghislaine also offered a dry greeting to his cousin. He actually remembered Cain's face quite well. He was the heir to the Lodge lands, with whom they held an alliance. And even young, Cain had proven himself an exceptional warrior. Back then, Cain was Ghislaine's only friend, but in reality, they were enemies. Slowly, Cain walked towards Ghislaine. Ghislaine asked Ricardo what was going on here. The young man explained they'd been informed about disturbances at a local tavern, and there they found Cain, who started asking if the rumors about Ghislaine were true. The commander began to tell him everything in detail, but then he was cut off. Cain was outraged that Skovan had lied right to his face. Ricardo concluded that everything had led to what Ghislaine was now seeing. Cain said it was better to tell the truth, and not lie about how Ghislaine managed to kill the orcs. That's why Cain decided to teach the commander a lesson. However, he blamed Ghislaine for what happened, since Ghislaine himself was spreading the rumors. Ghislaine didn't respond. After all, he remembered Cain always treated him like Ghislaine was his henchman. When he caused trouble, no one could say a word to him, because Ghislaine obeyed him. No one dared to disrespect Cain, especially Ghislaine, who had suffered from feelings of inferiority in the past, and Cain's audacious character had been seen as fitting for an heir. Ghislaine let out a small chuckle, remembering he'd been even more criticized for it. The whole time, Cain was watching the guy. He snickered, remembering how Ghislaine used to scream even at the slightest provocation. He was surprised when he was ordered to kill Ghislaine. In exchange, they promised his family would be well supported. Cain pointed out that Ghislaine was also an heir, so he couldn't just be eliminated that easily. They advised him to propose a duel and blame it all on an accident. The man told Cain it would be a golden opportunity. Cain hadn't expected to be ordered to kill his own cousin, but without hesitation, he decided to get right to it. Cain figured they wanted to get rid of Ghislaine because they'd noticed changes in him. He snickered at the thought. Then he asked Ghislaine what the heck he was doing now. Cain declared that since he'd arrived, it was high time Ghislaine brought him what was due. Since they'd interrupted the festival, Cain suggested they liven things up. After all, he was sure they were both on the same page when it came to having fun. Ghislaine was lost in thought for a moment. He didn't immediately grasp what the guy was saying and asked if Cain meant that. He remembered Cain always demanded drinks and women whenever he showed up. Before, Ghislaine had always agreed because he didn't want to get beaten, but now he wasn't about to spend his money. He suddenly recalled Belinda's words, and then a thought struck him, leaving him stunned. Ghislaine realized the source of income had been right there all along, and by that he meant Cain. The young man's thoughts were cut short by a sharp voice. Cain demanded everything be brought over since Ghislaine had already heard about it. Ghislaine agreed, but with one condition. First, he wanted Cain to pay his bills. Confused, Cain asked what bills he was even talking about. With a smirk, Ghislaine said that, with interest, Cain would have to cough up 1,000 gold pieces. Cain retorted, saying Ghislaine should have thought he was dealing with a friend. But Ghislaine shot back that he was simply wiping his feet on him. Ghislaine demanded the money be given to the boy until they forcibly ripped it from him. At that moment, the situation got super tense. Ricardo couldn't understand why Ghislaine was acting like that right in front of him. Standing up, Cain declared Ghislaine was mistaken if he thought he could be so insolent. And he added that Ghislaine hadn't gotten stronger by just spreading rumors about his victories. He squeezed his hand and said everyone considered Ghislaine useless because he only spouted nonsense. So Cain decided to jump into the fray, but Ghislaine remained calm right in front of him. He easily dodged the punch. Cain immediately threw another punch, but only hit air. When Cain left himself open, Ghislaine managed to land a hit on his side. The blow was pretty strong and left Cain stunned. Then Ghislaine attacked again, but Cain had already managed to block the kick. Seeing this, Ghislaine was a bit surprised. Suddenly, the man collapsed to the ground, screaming loudly in pain. A thief rushed over to him and asked what had happened. Ghislaine told him to stop complaining, because he saw Cain had blocked the blow. The man told Ghislaine to back off and was outraged by what the guy had done. Then everyone started wondering what was causing the commotion, and Ghislaine caught on. Suddenly, he realized what Cain was up to. Cain whispered to him, asking if he'd played his part well. The man agreed they had done a good job simulating what Ghislain had started. Then Cain started pulling something out. He was motivated by the fact that completing the request would guarantee him support. Plus, it was a great chance for him to get rid of the poor Pertium. Cain pulled a glove from his pocket, wanting to challenge the guy to a duel, but before he could finish, a glove also flew right into his face. Ghislain was the first to challenge Cain to a duel. Hearing this, Cain was stunned. Ghislain said Cain dared to attack and humiliate him in public, and also beat people up. He asked if Cain would deny it. There was a moment of silence. Cain knew Ghislain was stupid, but he didn't expect the guy to dig his own grave. Drawing his sword, he warned Ghislain not to regret it, but the guy remained calm in front of Cain. Then Ghislain turned to Ricardo. Suddenly, Ricardo was asked to bring all the merchants over, and he told him to say that their money would be found soon. The sudden cancellation of the festival put everyone in a bad mood, but spirits were still high because people couldn't spend their money. Ghislain decided that a good spectacle would help people unwind, and just like that, everything was set. The duel between them began in front of many spectators. Naturally, people wanted to place bets. Cain was outraged that Ghislain had turned the duel into a cheap show, and then he warned that his sword wouldn't stop even if Ghislain started begging for mercy. The guy just stayed silent in response. What he said was obvious, as that was Cain's real goal. Ghislain suggested they get started, seeing as there was a huge crowd, but suddenly, someone interrupted them. The man objected, claiming the bet was unfair. The audience was surprised to hear this. The bookie agreed that no one had placed a bet on Ghislain. For obvious reasons, Ghislain himself wasn't surprised by this. People started demanding that at least someone bet on Ghislain. Cain chuckled, saying Ghislain wasn't worth anything, not even at the market. So they decided to bet on how long he'd last against Cain. But suddenly, another bet popped up. The defeated Scoven bet on Ghislain. The guy smirked when he saw him, and then another bag appeared on the table behind him. This time, Helena and Belinda showed up. But seeing his sister and the maid, Ghislain was shocked. The onlookers were also stunned when they noticed Helena. They told Helena that would be enough, and Belinda warned her, trying to dissuade her. The thief looked displeased as he walked past, and Cain was annoyed at having to wait. When they could finally start the duel, Ghislain said he was older, so it would be wrong for him to go first. That said, he prepared his sword, and brandishing it, he prepared for battle. And then he told Cain he could attack. Looking at Ghislain, Cain frowned slightly. Then he said Ghislain was a bit late to start acting like an elder. In an instant, he was on Ghislain, but the guy managed to block his cousin's blow. Cain said the guy had stooped too low to try and save his own skin. Cain's blow made Ghislain lose his balance. He tried to attack quickly, but the guy dodged his blows. When Ghislain ducked, Cain tried to kick him, but he dodged and his leg kicked through the air. The observers then believed that Ghislain wouldn't be able to withstand even a single blow. Hearing the support, Cain chuckled. But, observing Cain, Ghislain raised an eyebrow thoughtfully. Belinda was terrified and thought the duel needed to be stopped, and the thief was glad Ghislain was doomed. Cain, after all, had an insane strength advantage, and once Ghislain ran out of breath, Cain would deliver the final blow. This was precisely the scenario that had led Cain to victory in all his battles. In the heat of battle, Cain realized Ghislain's skills had improved after all, so he spun his sword and grabbed it by the blade. As he struck, Ghislain blocked the attack, but then Cain suddenly yanked the sword towards him. Ghislain, still holding the sword, was pulled forward with it. Then with all his might, Cain hurled Ghislain into the air. At this sight, the audience gasped in suspense, and Ricardo worried for the young man. Meanwhile, the thief was practically gleeful at Ghislain's apparent demise. Once airborne, Ghislain began to plummet rapidly towards the ground, yet Ghislain remained eerily calm about the whole situation. As he landed, he declared he'd been lenient with Cain, but that Cain had now crossed the line. With a single, swift move, Ghislain closed the distance to his opponent. As he launched his attack, Cain had no time to block it. What's more, he didn't even have time to track Ghislain's movements. Even the bandit was stunned to see Ghislain regain his balance, channeling his mana into his legs. After the attack, the man exhaled heavily. He stated that Cain was terrible with weapons and simply intimidated his opponents with brute force. That's why Ghislain wanted to open his eyes. Hearing this, Cain absolutely flew into a rage. Not understanding what such a small thing could do to him, he swung his club again. Ghislain spun his body and delivered a powerful kick to Cain. Then he propelled himself off Cain's hand, launching into the air. He spun mid-air, attempting to wound Cain before landing. Enraged, Cain felt an urge to stab the man with his sword, but Ghislain reacted instantly, dodging the blade. Next, he stomped his foot down on it, effectively restricting Cain's movements, and with his other hand still gripping his sword, he delivered a devastating blow. His attack landed on Cain's unprotected neck. For an instant, Ghislaine calmly stared at his opponent, and then blood started gushing from Kane's many wounds. The crowd immediately erupted, completely caught off guard by how the fight was unfolding. Helena proudly asked Belinda if the maid had seen that. Scoven also let out a discreet chuckle, but the thief was furious and annoyed. Kane knew the wounds weren't deep, even though Ghislaine clearly had the power to hurt him more. He couldn't understand when Ghislaine had become so skilled with a sword. For a moment, silence fell between the opponents. Ghislaine stared silently at his opponent, but then, to Kane's utter surprise, he threw his sword aside. He declared that the strength difference didn't seem that great, so he'd fight with his bare hands. Naturally, this sent Kane into a rage, but Ghislaine pressed on, saying he needed to seize this opportunity to teach him a lesson, and his fists would be more than enough to get the job done. Hearing this, Kane was utterly indignant, but Ghislaine wanted to fight with his fists because it would give Kane an advantage. He even bet 2,000 gold coins that he'd win. The crowd immediately started whispering, as the duel had taken a bizarre turn. The thief was taken aback by this. In fact, he was secretly pleased Ghislaine was digging his own grave. From that moment on, they started accepting additional bets. Murmurs resurfaced and many decided to bet on Kane, but there were also those who now supported Ghislaine. However, Kane just found it amusing. Accepting the challenge, he dramatically shed his cloak, but at the same time, he decided to keep his sword and attack Ghislaine. Belinda cursed and began screaming in support of Ghislaine. In that very instant, Kane had already landed a punch on the guy. The guy let out a chuckle at Kane's complete lack of common sense. He easily dodged the sword. As this unfolded, Kane prepared to kick. However, reacting swiftly, Ghislaine rapidly shifted his stance. At the same time, he landed a punch on Kane's leg, and then he prepared to strike again. This time, his fist connected with his opponent's chin. Kane reeled back in intense pain and crashed to the ground. He couldn't fathom where Ghislaine could have learned to fight like that. The crowd began to roar, and more people started believing in Ghislaine's victory. Meanwhile, the guy was telling Kane to get up, because the fight wasn't over yet. Kane gradually started losing his patience. He rose from his seat and charged towards the young man. Kane continued to attack with his sword, but Ghislaine still expertly dodged the blows. In the heat of battle, he couldn't understand why. Until recently, Ghislaine hadn't even dared to look at him. But now, on the contrary, Ghislaine was proving to be stronger. Twisting Kane's arm, Ghislaine delivered a knee strike to his side. Kane was already severely wounded, but he still believed he needed to kill Ghislaine for the sake of his family's future. However, he could do nothing against Ghislaine and simply took his blows. After some time, he was battered and trembling in pain. Then Ghislaine approached him and grabbed him by the hair. Out of nowhere, the guy said he felt sorry for Kane's dad. Ghislaine recalled how, thanks to their friendship, Kane's father had helped Ghislaine's family back when the Pertiums were in deep trouble. But Ghislaine pointed out that Kane didn't share those ideals. Hearing this, Kane froze in shock. Suddenly, he remembered how, just a few years prior, everyone had tried to talk Kane's father out of helping the Pertiums. And it hadn't even been a week since he'd wanted to help that family yet again. Kane didn't get it, and he got furious. When he asked his father not to go, his dad paused. He asked his father why he was so determined to help if everyone was trying to stop him. His father silently turned to his son and simply said he considered Ghislaine's father a friend. Kane froze as he remembered that conversation. Right then, Ghislaine wanted to hit him again. Bracing for another hit, Kane closed his eyes, but no blow came, and then Kane's voice was heard. The guy figured Kane had finally learned his lesson. For a moment, Kane stared at the hand extended to him. Then he lowered his head. He managed to murmur that he admitted defeat. Not expecting this, the man was surprised. The crowd cheered, thrilled with Ghislaine's victory. Ghislaine's family was also ecstatic about his win. Shouting Kane's name, the thug rushed towards him. He was furious that he'd trusted Kane, and now he was just giving up. But Kane just told the man to screw off and added that he was leaving. The man was enraged, calling Kane a coward. Just then, Ghislaine appeared behind him and spoke to the man. Ghislaine smiled and said it was time to collect what was his. The man didn't immediately grasp what he was talking about. Then Ghislaine announced loudly that the man had offered to pay for everyone's meat and drinks. Hearing this, the man became even more indignant. He indignantly declared that he hadn't given his consent, so Ghislaine should take back what he said. But Ghislaine simply placed a hand on his shoulder. Ghislaine said this was the price of defeat, and it wouldn't even count towards the bet. Ghislaine reminded him that they still had to leave 2,000 gold coins on top, and immediately after, he subtly hinted at what would happen to the man if he dared to try and escape. Seeing the formidable Ghislaine, the man was terrified. Once he agreed to pay, Ghislaine left him and walked away. The next day, Ghislaine had the money. He figured with that, he could hire a small detachment of mercenaries, but since it would take too long to earn enough money, that plan didn't work out for the guy. Suddenly, Belinda and Helena appeared in the room. Ghislaine looked at them and asked what was up. Helena sarcastically asked what Ghislaine planned to spend it on, and when her brother asked if she needed anything, Helena replied that she was just asking. Suddenly, Belinda chimed in, saying it was obvious where Ghislaine would spend it. She went on, saying Lady Amelia's birthday was coming up, and Ghislaine probably wanted to buy her an expensive gift. While the girls chattered on about it, Ghislaine himself remained silent. In fact, he was surprised he even had a fiancé. So the guy decided to ask directly about it. Belinda thought he was faking it on purpose, but Helena replied that he was talking about Count Reifold's daughter. Hearing this, the guy was even more stunned, but at that moment he finally understood who they were talking about. Amelia was loved by everyone for her kind nature and good deeds, but in the future, she would lead a rebellion in the north and be known as the Witch of the North. She also took part in Delphine's plan to overthrow the Ghislaine family. The guy was furious just thinking about this traitor. He asked when his father would be back and was told he'd return in about a week. Ghislaine figured that would be enough time for him. He was going to visit the Reifolds, but Belinda didn't understand why. Since Amelia's birthday hadn't arrived yet, he simply replied that he wanted to collect some debts. Meanwhile, Amelia's daily life continued as usual. She had just received new shoes, and she offered them to a common village girl. The girl was deeply moved when Amelia offered her the new shoes. Amelia replied that if anyone had the right to walk barefoot on her lands, it would be her. Then, she ordered the guards to provide shelter and food for the people. As the guards began to carry out the order, a noise was heard. Stepping out, Amelia was met with a chorus of thanks. Back home, her legs were tended to, and Bernard showered her with praise for a job well done. The girl then blurted out that her father always demanded absolute obedience, but she knew most people followed those who offered shelter and bread. Bernard replied that since she'd won so many hearts, he'd definitely give her the push needed to swing the inheritance dispute in her favor. The girl stared at him silent. Then she delivered a swift kick to his face. She demanded to know about that duel against the Northern Swordmaster. Bernard apologized, explaining that if he'd won, he could have lured the man to their side. He then kissed her foot, vowing his sword would always serve her, but she simply asked if this was how she'd raised him. She gripped his chin hard and told Bernard not to be a weakling. He also reported that the Merchant Guild had bought all the materials for the checkpoint's construction. They'd even bought off all the soldiers and knights who'd abandoned the Pertium lands. Amelia praised him, telling him to keep up the facade of a regular merchant guild. Suddenly, their conversation was cut short by a servant. The servant announced a message from the gatekeepers. Ghislaine had arrived for a visit. Amelia, displeased, demanded to know what that limping fellow was doing here. The servant hesitated, unsure how to answer the girl. Everyone was then surprised to hear Ghislaine wanted to discuss something related to the Merchant Guild. Soon after, Amelia found Ghislaine in the living room. Sitting opposite her, Ghislaine greeted her, but she didn't respond and her cat hissed. The girl, displeased, declared it rude to enter unannounced. The young man replied he'd already decided to give her a gift. Showing a flower, he said he'd bought it from the guild's storefront. He then declared he'd now decided to always buy from her guild. Amelia remained silent, a slight frown on her face. She then shot up, declaring she didn't quite grasp his meaning. Displeased, she stated Ghislaine's gift was accepted, so he could leave. But Ghislaine, with a smirk, told her to return to her seat. Hearing his tone, the girl froze. Turning to face him, she wondered if this was truly the same guy who used to just bleat when he saw her. Ghislaine immediately stated he needed money, 10,000 gold pieces. Hearing such a sum, the girl frowned. Amelia was indignant, asking if this was meant to be her family's will, but Ghislaine said it only concerned him. He then added that Amelia wouldn't marry him anyway. The girl stopped dead, frowning in surprise. Ghislaine continued, saying he'd rather marry the knight behind the door, and then he revealed his true strength. The next instant, he was cut off by Amelia's cat, letting out a fierce hiss. Standing before the man, the cat kept hissing. The girl retorted dryly that such things couldn't be said, not even as a joke. Ghislaine then promised to keep everything a secret if he got the loan, but Amelia kept refusing. When she called for Bernard, he entered immediately. Approaching Ghislaine, he greeted the young man. Ghislaine knew Bernard was a huge support for Amelia, and he knew that even now the man possessed strength comparable to a swordmaster's. Ghislaine declared that if he died there, a land war would erupt. Amelia retorted that they'd make it look like the meddling intruder was killed by a bodyguard for invading the bride's quarters. She told Bernard to get rid of the guy. Ready to obey, Bernard drew his sword. Even though Amelia had gone too far, Ghislaine wasn't surprised. Instead, he decided to get serious too. Preparing for the fight, Ghislaine also drew his sword. As Bernard watched the young man, an ironic smile played on his lips. Ghislaine was also watching Bernard, but suddenly noticed something. There was a sudden movement behind him. It turned out they'd decided to attack him from a blind spot, but the enemy's sword sliced through the back of the chair. The man kept advancing, and Ghislain executed a somersault. At the perfect moment, he stretched out his legs, striking the man. A loud crash followed as the window shattered, hitting the man and his chair. Seeing this, Amelia and Bernard were stunned. Ghislain was outraged that they'd sent an assassin to kill him. Declaring their hospitality abysmal, he braced for a fight. Then the opponent's swords clashed in battle. Ghislain dryly remarked that good manners weren't taught in the Reifold household. Bernard retorted that Ghislain was the first to show disrespect, and he believed Ghislain had no right to a warm reception after that. Bernard tried to strike Ghislain, but the boy dodged. Ghislain spun around and tried to kick, but missed. Then he kicked with his other leg and hit his mark. Bernard reeled back from the powerful kick. He'd known Ghislain as someone with no skills, but now it was clear the guy was highly skilled. Interrupting his thoughts, Amelia told Bernard to get serious. She demanded he move and bring her Ghislain's head. At her glare, Bernard froze for an instant, but then he got serious and prepared to kill Ghislain. Ghislain just chuckled, realizing a common knight had behaved that way with him. Bernard retorted that it was just an invitation to fight. Then both opponents braced themselves for a firm attack. Bernard was the first to close in, reaching Ghislain in an instant. But reacting quickly, Ghislain pulled back slightly and dodged. However, Bernard's attack left a small cut on the boy's cheek. Bernard proved to be quite fast. Then they began fighting in earnest, constantly dodging and striking each other. Watching them, Amelia couldn't understand how Ghislain could fight Bernard on equal footing, but suddenly, she frowned. Meanwhile, the battle only intensified. Ghislain blocked the sword that was dangerously close to his face. He then stepped forward and tried to strike Bernard. Luckily, Bernard managed to avoid the blow, and then he decided to pin the guy's sword. As he did so, he tried to pierce Ghislain with his blade, but Ghislain just asked why Bernard was doing that again. With that, Ghislain leaped into the air, but as he did, he realized something had changed. A massive amount of mana began to emanate from Bernard. Bernard replied that those techniques hadn't worked on him the 2 times they'd been used. Then he managed to repel Ghislain's attack and knock the boy to the ground. The blow was powerful, and Ghislain grimaced in pain. Without waiting for him to make another move, Bernard was about to strike again, but Ghislain managed to evade the sword, and then he retreated a few meters, creating distance. He hadn't expected Bernard to use mana to neutralize the move. Suddenly, Bernard stated that Ghislain was truly different from the rumors. Tossing Ghislain's sword aside, he added that the boy had battle experience, not just refined training moves. He added that those techniques worked well, but not on him. Bernard was then certain it was all over for Ghislain. Ghislain had already realized they'd crossed the line. Bernard aimed directly for the head, and in close combat, it was hard to overcome the physical difference with technique alone. Because of this, he figured it wasn't worth bothering with Bernard, but Ghislain just said he was also short on time. With that, he prepared to attack. To his surprise, Bernard saw mana and threads. He realized too late that Ghislain would use the threads. In that instant, Ghislain's sword had already struck the man's nape. With a swift move, Ghislain closed in on Bernard, and he slammed his knee into Bernard's face with all his might. Bernard staggered back, not understanding how the boy had done that. At that moment, Amelia also began to worry about her knight. Then Ghislain had already drawn his sword and was ready to strike. He struck with all his might, but Bernard held his ground, sword still firm. Right after, he immediately spun around. He managed to fend off Ghislain for a brief moment, shaking off his attack. Ghislain quickly regained his balance, landing firmly. Bernard then urged the girl to get out. After all, he couldn't guarantee her safety anymore, and was about to pull out all his trump cards. Ghislain conceded this was the proper way to fight him. The guy admitted it had been ages since he'd faced a worthy opponent. Hearing Bernard, Amelia started to flee. She was absolutely furious that Ghislain dared to humiliate her. She kept thinking someone had leaked info about the trade guild, and thanks to the rumors about Ghislain, she'd just assumed he'd gotten lucky back then. But now she realized just how wrong she'd been about him. She wondered aloud what the guards she'd stationed were even doing. But as she rounded the corner, she saw all her people had been utterly defeated. A girl stood in the middle, turning at the sound of her voice. Seeing Amelia, Belinda greeted the girl. Amelia demanded to know who she was, but the girl simply told Amelia to shut up. In that instant, she suddenly appeared behind Amelia. The knife pressed against her throat left Amelia utterly bewildered. After ripping off the spider, Belinda was surprised Amelia was still wearing it. The girl smiled, saying she figured it was all because of the engagement. Belinda knew Amelia's family disliked her because insects constantly followed her, so she created her own to get revenge on everyone, though she wasn't sure if it was trauma or just self-affirmation. After tossing the spider aside, she told Amelia it didn't suit her. Then she crushed the spider and demanded cooperation. More mana began to emanate from Bernard. almost filling the entire room. Ghislaine realized even the air had grown heavy. This mana was simply too much for him. Bernard again questioned Ghislaine, calling him a worthy opponent. And then he asked how Ghislaine could possibly consider himself an aristocrat on par with Amelia. Ghislaine confirmed he was an aristocrat, but couldn't fathom such a statement coming from a mere bodyguard. A moment of tense silence hung in the air, and then they clashed once more. Pressing his attack, Bernard demanded he not dishonor the aristocracy's name. The attacks were lightning fast, but Ghislaine still managed to block them. Still, they posed a constant, grave threat. In the heat of battle, he realized Bernard was absolutely enraged. He relentlessly harassed Ghislaine with his attacks, but eventually the guy had enough. Gripping his sword tighter, he finally knocked Bernard's blade away. Then he delivered a powerful blow, ready to strike the man down. But Bernard reacted, deciding to counterattack. In doing so, he disarmed his opponent. Ghislaine was stunned by the force of that last strike, and then Bernard declared that would be Ghislaine's final attack. In that instant, his sword was pointed directly at Ghislaine's neck, but for some reason, his face twisted into a confused expression. It turned out Ghislaine was prepared to injure himself, intentionally using his shoulder to deflect the blade. Capitalizing on the other's confusion, Ghislaine attacked back. Bernard was irritated. With Ghislaine, there was never a moment to relax. But he managed to deflect Ghislaine's sword once more, and then he kicked the guy hard in the side. The man declared there was a huge difference between someone experienced and someone who just brandished a sword to show off. Ghislaine slammed his back against the wall with full force, but he could still keep fighting. Ghislaine analyzed that Bernard's speed and attack sequence allowed him to control the battle's flow, and in a direct clash, it felt like their blades were locked, unable to be separated. Ghislaine knew that with the mana he currently had, he couldn't beat Bernard, but that was only about the mana Ghislaine had at that very moment. He realized Bernard was missing one crucial thing. After all, Bernard had no idea Ghislaine possessed a unique mana cultivation technique. The moment he started using it, Ghislaine's speed skyrocketed, and in an instant, he was right beside Bernard. Their swords clashed again, a furious dance of steel. But just moments later, Ghislaine managed to disarm his opponent. When it happened, Bernard was utterly stunned. He couldn't fathom where this guy pulled so much mana from in the middle of their fight. As the tip of his sword touched Bernard's head, Ghislaine stopped. Just then, Belinda and Amelia walked into the room. Amelia told Ghislaine he could take the money and leave. Ghislaine shot back, asking why she couldn't just give him the money when he'd asked nicely. With that, he pulled his sword away from Bernard. Belinda scoffed, saying this couldn't even be called a lover's quarrel. Ghislaine simply replied that they just didn't see eye to eye on the matter. Then, he dropped some bad news on Amelia. After all, he'd now settle for nothing less than 20,000 gold pieces. As Ghislaine walked out, a commotion erupted in the palace. In a fit of rage, Amelia continued to smash everything around her. Bernard apologized, saying what happened was his fault, but the girl ignored him, muttering that Ghislaine had changed too much. Bernard asked if she wanted to report this to Duchess Delphine, but Amelia slapped him, and she snapped at him to watch his tongue, because Duchess Delphine was a terrifying person. She then admitted she was secretly collaborating with Delphine because Delphine would help her get rid of the Pertiums. But she was even more furious about what would happen if the commercial guild's secret was exposed. So, they had to kill Ghislaine. After hearing her out, Bernard accepted her demand. He reported that Ghislaine had a deep wound on his shoulder and several minor cuts, and since he'd used so much mana, he'd need time to recover. However, something was bothering Bernard. He said they shouldn't use their knights. Amelia agreed, saying they'd need dogs specifically bred for this kind of work. Bernard was horrified, imagining what Amelia was planning. The girl ordered them to send war orphans, those with no family or status. She demanded they gather a dozen individuals skilled in mana control. Meanwhile, Bernard was already plotting where they could set up an ambush. After mulling it over, he promised Amelia he'd prepare everything, and Amelia was practically salivating, eager to see how Ghislaine would pay for humiliating her. Meanwhile, Ghislaine continued on his way, bandaging his wounds. He couldn't stop thinking about the treacherous Amelia. Others were worried about Ghislaine, but he calmed everyone, assuring them he was fine. He figured for such a risky stunt, the wound wasn't that deep, but it paid off, because now Ghislaine had a massive amount of money. He'd gladly strangle Amelia too, but he didn't want to start a war. Since they were already defending themselves against barbarians, Ghislaine decided to resolve the situation with the least amount of bloodshed possible, and this time, Ghislaine was going to put Amelia to use. Belinda watched the boy in silence, but suddenly, she asked if everything had gone as planned. She said he'd ordered her to take over security if she heard sounds of fighting, and to take Amelia hostage. Ghislaine agreed that was the plan, but then asked Fergus about it. The moment the boy said that, he felt an intense pain. Because of it, Ghislaine cowered and left everyone worried. Now Ghislaine understood the consequences of activating the third core, and and that, over time, it could cause serious issues. He was thinking of finding a safe way to increase his mana when, suddenly, Belinda grabbed his hand. The girl decided to check the boy's pulse, and then she said his mana flow was severely disrupted. Then, a strange light began to emanate from her hands. Observing the process, Ghislain began to figure out what was happening, but then he again felt intense pain and nausea. But instead of the usual blood, he expelled strange air. Ghislain realized that the stagnation in his mana channels had dissipated, and that such a cure was possible with deep mana compression. Belinda had been brought by Ghislain's mother, so he'd figured the maid was no ordinary maid. But in reality, he didn't know exactly who she was. Ghislain understood that the more powerful allies he had, the better. Belinda suddenly said she believed in Ghislain and would always be ready to help. Then she asked why Ghislain needed so much money. After a brief silence, the boy said Amelia was the only one who could get the money. Belinda and Fergus were surprised to hear this argument. Belinda said he'd land in deep trouble if someone found out, but the boy guaranteed that Amelia wouldn't tell anyone. And then he asked if Belinda believed him. The girl agreed, and asked him to tell her how he intended to spend the money. But when Ghislain spoke of the monster forest, Belinda was frozen in horror. Ghislain stated gravely that they needed resources to clear the forest. Fergus found that unthinkable, as they had tried to clear the forest for ages, but to no avail. Cutting him off, Ghislain asked what had happened to the request he'd made before he left. The old man looked a little confused by that question, and then he replied that the person Ghislain was talking about was right there. Ghislain replied that he would head there right away, but Belinda insisted on going back home. Then Ghislain reminded him that Amelia wouldn't let any of this slide. Belinda said she and Fergus had a good fight, but the boy shot back that circumstances had changed. And now Ghislain wanted to track down a responsible commander. That's why they had ventured into the desolate wilderness. The place looked deserted and no one answered the door, but they were definitely in the right place. Suddenly the door opened and a man appeared. Covered in a thick beard, he asked who was there. Upon seeing him, everyone but Ghislain was stunned. Belinda said the man looked like a wreck and definitely not a responsible commander. However, Ghislain replied that he was the very man standing right in front of them. As he slammed the door shut, the man told them to leave and not waste his time. Then Ghislain called Jillian by name, and that made the mercenary captain freeze. The man slowly turned to face the young man, and he saw how, extending his hand, Ghislain said he'd missed Jillian. Everyone was shocked to hear about the mercenary squad. The Ratatosk mercenary group was so legendary that even after it disbanded, everyone still remembered them. And their leader was none other than Jillian, whom Ghislain invited to join them. But in that very instant, an axe came flying through the air. It whizzed past Ghislain, tearing his clothes. The sudden attack left everyone speechless. Jillian demanded in a harsh tone how that guy knew about him, and he wanted to know why Ghislain had come here. Belinda told Ghislain to back off, unsure if the man was in his right mind. But Ghislain insisted he knew how to help Jillian's daughter, so he was urged to speak calmly. Patients suffered from fever and coughed up blood. Those afflicted by the disease writhed in agony until death. This is why it earned the nickname, the Endless Punishment. Racked with intense pain, the girl screamed, her cries echoing through the room. As Jillian approached, she embraced her daughter. Ghislain realized it wasn't too late. In the past, Ghislain couldn't hire Jillian because she had committed suicide after her daughter's death. And judging by the state of the place, it was clear Jillian had spent all her money on the girl's treatment. The girl screamed that she wanted to die, unable to endure the agony. Ghislain realized there was no time to lose and decided to start the treatment, but suddenly someone stopped him dead. Belinda told Ghislain to leave. She questioned how they could possibly help when even the priests had failed. But Ghislain broke free, declaring he was the only one who could help. Then he asked Belinda again if she believed him. Hearing the question again, the girl was confused. Ghislain then handed her a note, asking her to buy everything listed on it. The girl was stunned by the note's contents. This disease was thought incurable, but a cure would be discovered in the future. Since the topic had been widely discussed, Ghislain remembered the antidote's preparation in vivid detail. The only problem was the ingredients were expensive, but they had the funds. So Ghislain began to concoct it, and when he finished, he handed the medicine to the man. Ghislain simply stated that Rachel needed to drink it. Without hesitation, Jillian gave her daughter the antidote. At first, nothing happened, but soon, the spots on her skin started to vanish. They were getting fewer and fewer, and the girl's face took on a calm expression. When everyone saw this, they were shocked. They were amazed to see the marks truly starting to vanish. Jillian found it hard to believe the medicine had actually worked. Ghislain said everything seemed to be working. Jillian asked how this was possible, since even healers with great powers were helpless. Ghislain replied that the power of saints wasn't limitless. and it depended on the patient's strength and will to live. Then the man's hands began to tremble. He asked if his daughter could now be cured. Ghislaine said she would be cured in 2 months. Hearing this, hope flared in Jillian's eyes, and then, shocked by what had happened, he collapsed to the floor. He begged Ghislaine to tell him what the guy wanted, because he probably hadn't come all this way for nothing. And since Jillian only had his body, he was willing to become, at the very least, a slave. Ghislaine replied that he only needed a true leader for the mercenaries. In that instant, Jillian looked into the young man's eyes, and he wondered what those eyes were truly searching for. The man silently ran his hand through his braided hair, and in his other hand, an axe, with which he cut off a braid. When everyone looked at Jillian, they were stunned. They could barely believe their eyes. It was as if a completely different person had appeared before them. Turning around, Jillian headed to the other side of the room, and he asked if there was anyone else with Ghislaine, perhaps enemies. Ghislaine replied that everyone who came with him was inside the room. Then Jillian asked if Ghislaine had anyone who envied him, and the guy shot back that there'd be even more of them coming. Jillian snatched the spear and hurled it against the wall. The spear ripped a massive hole, flying straight into a tree. Then Jillian yanked the rope tied to the spear. With that, he dragged the spy right in, and as he grabbed him by the neck, the man let out a choked gasp. Jillian demanded to know who sent him. The man simply said it was impossible. Jillian then asked what to do with the man, but Ghislaine told him to keep quiet, since the kid had already figured out who sent the spy. Ghislaine admitted he didn't want to get his hands dirty today. However, the man stopped him. Jillian declared he'd handle it himself. With that, he squeezed the man's throat and ended him. When it was all over, he bowed to Ghislaine. Belinda noticed there was no hesitation in the man's movements, but she couldn't understand why Ghislaine needed such a fierce man. Meanwhile, Jillian swore his life now belonged to Ghislaine. Ghislaine replied he'd be counting on the commander. Before long, Ghislaine's envious rivals learned the reconnaissance squad had been wiped out, but one of them managed to calm everyone down. Realizing they'd made too much noise, the soldiers apologized to the captain. The captain went on, saying it was unlikely Ghislaine had uncovered the spies by himself. Then he found out the guy had apparently hired Jillian. This news enraged the man, who then grabbed one of his soldiers. He angrily demanded if it was true. Trembling with fear, the man confirmed he'd seen it with his own eyes. The captain was pleased Jillian had finally shown up. Meanwhile, they were moving through the forest. Belinda complained the cart was cramped. She said Jillian wasn't into trading weapons, so a sword or an axe would be enough for him. Ghislaine told her to drop it, since they'd need a cart to transport Rachel anyway. He asked for patience, saying all this could come in handy. Then she asked if that spy had been sent by Amelia. After getting confirmation, she declared it a problem. After all, the man wore a mask typical of the Wildcat Guild. Ghislaine knew that guild was illegal. They were smugglers, murderers, and drug traffickers. Belinda said they were a powerful dark guild, often having retired mercenaries among their ranks. That's why she told Ghislaine to be more careful. But Ghislaine said there was nothing to worry about. After all, Ghislaine now depended on Jillian. They continued on their way when suddenly someone approached them. Jillian immediately sensed the enemy's presence. However, they had the cart in their sights and were aiming for Jillian. However, the man reached for the weapon on his back. Wielding his sword and axe, he blocked both blows. Then he struck back at the assassins. He even cut one of them in half. Their bodies hit the ground, and the cart kept moving on its own. The other people sitting in the trees cut the ropes, and at that instant, a tree started falling towards the cart. Belinda screamed that it looked like they were about to be caught. However, with a tug on the reins, Jillian changed the cart's direction. The cart stopped, and the tree fell not far from it. Ghislaine wasn't surprised by the ambush. However, the cart was surrounded by dozens of people. One of them turned to Jillian. Hearing his name, Jillian looked at the squad leader. The assassin called Jillian a coward, saying he dismantled the gang because of his daughter. Stepping out of the cart, Jillian said he couldn't understand the words. The assassin went on to say that because of Jillian, his life had fallen apart, and that Jillian didn't even recognize his old friend anymore. Jillian remained silent. The commander then assumed Jillian was pretending not to recognize him, so he ordered his men to join the fray. Ghislaine offered to help, but Jillian refused. As everyone attacked the man, a huge amount of mana began to emanate from him, and in an instant, he wiped out all the enemies. Undeterred, the others kept advancing. Blocking the weapon, Jillian used an axe to open up the assassin's body. He cut off the next man's hand and struck him in the neck with an axe. He also easily blocked the next assassin's attack, and with an axe swing, he chopped off his own hand. The captain realized that Jillian's strength hadn't faded. Next, he ordered the detachment to split up and approach from two sides. In response, Jillian mounted his horse. As everyone watched in confusion, Jillian grabbed the weapon that was on the horse, and then, brandishing his axe, he charged forward. To give the blow more force, he gripped the weapon with both hands, and he attacked several people at once. Then, one of the thieves said someone should scare the horse, but without giving them any chance, Jillian kept slaughtering them all. Seeing this, Belinda was even a little horrified. At that moment, one of the assassins decided to attack the man from above, but reacting quickly, he covered himself with a shield. The captain declared that Jillian couldn't possibly interfere with the life of the person he was already destroying, and then he swore to kill the man. Leaping back, he attacked the horse. Due to severe injuries, the animal immediately fell to the ground. When Jillian landed, they immediately tried to attack him, but he blocked the blow with his axe. Then he slammed his shield into the man's side. After the hit, the assassin leaped back several feet. He was shocked to learn Jillian was no longer Ratatosk's leader. He demanded to know who was, if not Jillian. Jillian replied that he'd left the past behind, and now he was nothing more than Ghislaine's assistant. This only enraged the assassin even further. He charged forward, vowing once again to kill Jillian, and with that, their battle began. Jillian effortlessly blocked the blows with his shield. The assassin spat that with Jillian gone, their squad had fallen apart, and because of him, the assassin had lost his purpose in life. Jillian had no reply. He continued to silently clash with the mercenary, but the mercenary was strong too, deftly dodging Jillian's attacks. With a swift kick, the man managed to strike the shield. The shield couldn't withstand the pressure, and a hole ripped through it. He went on, declaring he'd dedicated his life to their unit, pouring his all into it, and Jillian had thrown it all away to become someone's lapdog. For that, the assassin could never forgive his former comrade. With that, he glared daggers at Jillian. His shield useless, Jillian began to retaliate with his weapon. As he dodged the blades, the assassin suddenly appeared right in front of him, but Jillian reacted fast, pulling back and evading the strike. Jillian tried to attack, but the assassin deftly dodged that too. Meanwhile, the assassin stared at Jillian like a madman. He admitted Jillian used to be strong, but while Jillian was busy worrying about his daughter, the mercenary had been relentlessly honing himself. Now, Jillian was no match for him. The assassin then kicked the blades stuck in the ground, sending them flying and pointing them right back at Jillian, but he blocked them with his hand. As he did, the assassin closed in on Jillian again. Sensing his presence, Jillian tried to attack, but the assassin managed to jump and dodge. As he attacked Jillian, the mercenary wanted to end it. However, Jillian intercepted the knife with his bare hand. Finally, he asked if that was truly the only reason for his revenge. At that moment, the mercenary realized Jillian hadn't been fighting with his full strength the entire time. As he thought this, something heavy slammed into his face. The blow sent him flying backward. The mercenary's flight was abruptly halted by the tree he crashed into. Suddenly, Jillian said he didn't understand. After all, the mercenary had had plenty of opportunities for revenge. Jillian asked why the mercenary hadn't come for him sooner. The man laughed because Jillian didn't know. The man said he was the one who came, but he didn't find a leader, just an old man he was sick of getting his hands dirty with. He asked where Jillian, the one the mercenary idolized, had gone. Jillian threw his blade to the ground and said he now serves another, but now he would pay great homage to his old comrade, just like Commander Ratatosk. Gripping his sword, the mercenary wished for a real fight to begin, but Jillian easily blocked his strike. But the mercenary yelled that this was exactly the fight he'd been waiting for. They attacked each other with lightning speed. Jillian lunged forward and tried to attack, but his blows were dodged. The same happened when the mercenary tried to attack, but finally, one of them gave up, and Jillian managed to strike the mercenary. The man's face was contorted in intense pain, but he kept fighting. At one point, Jillian brandished his axe and said he remembered the captain of the 5th Squadron, Ratatosk, and he even addressed Viego by name. Hearing this, the man smiled. After that, Jillian killed him. For a while, he stood over the body of his fallen comrade. Suddenly, someone praised him for his efforts. Belinda and Ghislaine approached him, and the girl chattered that they'd make good money selling these things. Jillian apologized for dragging out the fight, but to Ghislaine it meant nothing. In fact, Jillian had exceeded all his expectations. In the past, stories about Jillian began by describing his rise as the king of mercenaries. Suddenly, he asked Jillian if he remembered that man. Jillian confirmed it was his old comrade. Hearing the word comrade, Ghislaine pondered. Suddenly, he wondered what his comrades were doing now, since before meeting them, each had their own life. One day, Ghislaine would gather them again. 2 days later, they arrived in the lands of Pertium. Jillian asked if these were the same lands, and Ghislaine confirmed it briefly. The guy thought it was good to be able to return to something, because in the past, he didn't have that. Jillian kept looking at Ghislaine but remained silent. Then Ghislaine asked the man what he thought of his lands, and he replied that they weren't bad. bad, and Ghislain agreed they were terrible. Jillian had heard these lands were constantly at war with barbarians, but everything turned out worse than he expected. Ghislain wanted to solve these problems, so he asked Jillian for help. The battle promised to be long, but the young man was determined to restore the lands. Suddenly, Belinda saw something ahead and screamed. Looking at the horizon, Ghislain's gaze also took on a touch of surprise. Ahead of him, he saw the man who was his father. The councils discussed the best way to utilize the available forces, but some believed the Wraithfolds were useless, as they reported them attacking soldiers. Ghislain listened to all this conversation in silence, and with a smile, he thought nothing had changed. Even though he was a young gentleman, he had decades of experience. Then the guy told everyone they had worked hard, and then he turned to his father. His father looked sternly at his son. Ghislain remembered that as a child, he was afraid of his father because of his stern expression, but now he understood why his father was like that. It was due to the sheer weight of responsibility his father bore. His father asked where Ghislain had been for a week. The guy replied that he had gone to visit the Wraithfolds. His father asked if he had caused any trouble, but the boy said no. Then, suddenly, a man said that Ghislain had won money in a duel with Cain, and then the man asked if the young man had already managed to spend it. Ghislain replied that he had simply gone to settle a matter with Amelia. Another man intervened and reminded him of the responsibility Ghislain had as an heir. Then the Count interrupted everyone. Ghislain learned from him that there were still problems. He asked if it was true that Ghislain had killed Jamal and Felipe, who were trying to sell Helena. Ghislain immediately remembered those nights. Another man said that Ghislain probably wouldn't be able to handle them, so he pitted them against each other. The knights were traitors, but Ghislain understood that no one was happy about their deaths. Ghislain said that's pretty much what happened, and the man was satisfied with his own perception. Suddenly, Ghislain heard praise. His father said the most important thing was that Helena was safe. Ghislain was surprised, as it was the first time his father had praised him, so he decided to ask his father for a favor. A man said that if it was about money, it wasn't going to happen. Another agreed that Ghislain had too many sins. In his fury, he rattled off a list of them, and Ghislain had no comeback because it was all true. Ghislain replied that, as a courtesy, he wanted to ask his father's permission, but he would still go ahead with the plan anyway. But he refused to tell Belinda about it for the time being. After all, he knew a leak would cause trouble. He knew the monster forest held a spot teeming with runic stones. This mineral was imbued with magic, driving everyone wild for it. It was often used to craft various tools, basically anywhere magic was involved. Historically, the Delphine family had seized control of its deposits, but knowing all this, he wanted to change things. Belinda, however, hated being kept out of the loop. Still, she agreed to follow Ghislain's every word. When he asked to hire an army, Jillian questioned if he was truly sure, warning it would draw unwanted attention. But Ghislain knew just the right people, and even planned to handpick them. Jillian immediately caught on to who Ghislain meant. Though powerful, these mercenaries would tear you limb from limb if they weren't satisfied. Even so, Ghislain was set on hiring the Cberus mercenary squad. The very next day, they set out to tame these wild dogs. Their camp was nestled on the outskirts of the territory. As Jillian and Ghislain neared the camp, they were immediately spotted. The mercenaries snickered, realizing the travelers looked utterly lost. One of them scoffed, saying they looked like common aristocrats. But when he peered through the telescope again, he saw a sudden, jarring movement. Then a blood-curdling scream ripped through the air, seizing the attention of every mercenary. Jillian had suddenly lunged at one of them, seizing him by the head. He began to squeeze the poor man's head with crushing force. But then, with a flick of his wrist, he sent the mercenary flying. Seeing Jillian's strength, all the mercenaries grew wary. Sensing something was off with the old man, they drew their weapons and surrounded him. Suddenly, someone declared that not even an aristocrat dared to approach them like that. The man snarled that the travelers wouldn't leave there alive, but suddenly, the smile vanished from his face. That's because Ghislain stepped forward. The guy asked who was in charge here. Then the man strode towards the young man. Addressing the mercenaries, the aristocrat shocked them with his sheer audacity. But finally, the mercenary smirked. He declared they were dealing with just another crazy aristocrat, and then he swung his weapon, and he hurled it at the guy with all his might. As the heavy object approached him, Ghislain didn't even flinch, but suddenly, the weapon veered off course. That's because Jillian stepped in. The man was stunned to see the chain pierced by a sword. Ghislain had a feeling he wouldn't be taken kindly to. He told Jillian to do as he pleased, but not to kill the mercenaries. Obeying the command, the man yanked the chain. The weapon's owner was dragged along with it. With a surge of strength, Jillian flung flung the man skyward, but then the chain coiled around his neck. He then attacked the mercenary with mana. As the man struggled, others jumped into the fight, but Jillian snatched up the man's body, and then he hurled the body at the charging mercenaries. They all crashed down in a heap. Once done, Jillian turned his gaze to the remaining men. Meeting his gaze, the others froze in terror. Dismounting his horse, Ghislain demanded to know how much longer he'd have to wait. He insisted they finally bring the boss out. Suddenly, some guy piped up, saying he'd been sleeping soundly before all this. Kaur introduced himself, asking what Ghislain wanted. Ghislain replied he wanted to hire them, but Kaur was absolutely furious, given Ghislain had just beaten up his men. Kaur calmly stated that aristocrats should really know how to mind their manners, but Ghislain shot back that it was merely a greeting and the best way to ensure obedience. The boy just chuckled, asking if Ghislain planned a full-blown massacre next time. After that, Kaur agreed to consider the guy's proposal. Ghislain then revealed the discussion would be about the monster forest. That's why he needed mercenaries. Kaur then demanded to know who Ghislain was to just waltz into their territory. So Ghislain introduced himself, and the moment they learned his identity, the mercenaries went dead silent. Then everyone burst into laughter, declaring his antics were no longer surprising. Kaur then flat out said there was no place for people like Ghislain here, and he didn't want to hear another word. Right then, he considered negotiations officially over. Ghislain fell silent for a moment. Suddenly someone asked Kaur if he was actually scared. Ghislain let out a little chuckle, realizing the rumors about their squad were apparently being wildly exaggerated. So Kaur quickly changed his tune, suggesting they discuss the price, since they were mercenaries after all. Ghislain simply scoffed that the weak always look for excuses. Kaur retorted that he could have just been messing with him, but Ghislain's taunts had ruined everything. So Kaur demanded Ghislain pay for the damages and just leave, but Ghislain wasn't having any of it. Ghislain then called out to Kaur, revealing he had Moriana's confession. Kaur asked the guy if he even knew what that meant, and Ghislain, of course, replied that he absolutely did. That was the name of a traditional duel in the mercenary world. Combatants had to fight without mana, their dominant hands bound. The fight took place within a circle, and leaving it was not an option. Many times, both participants ended up dead. Ghislain knew the loser had to obey the victor. He challenged Kaur to a duel. Jillian was shocked Ghislain wanted to follow mercenary customs. Refusing a duel was dishonorable, so Kaur couldn't back down. As they awaited his answer, the tension in the room became palpable. Finally, Kaur declared that if the master wanted mercenary-style recognition, they had to respect his choice. In no time, everything was ready for the fight. After their hands were bandaged, the opponents entered the circle. Jillian watched in silence as the mercenaries roared in support of their leader. Kaur told Ghislain that even if the kid learned a few tricks, he wouldn't win, and there was no turning back. When Ghislain was suddenly yanked forward, he didn't expect it. Kaur pulled the boy close, informing him he'd won this way 5 times already. Ghislain pulled back, then declared that 5 wasn't enough. He then pulled Kaur close in return. Kaur replied he'd won like that hundreds of times. The moment they heard the starting signal, their attitudes shifted. In an instant, they lunged, blades aimed at each other's throats, simultaneously dodging the incoming attack. Looking at Ghislain, confusion was clear in his eyes. He hadn't expected such a reaction from a mere aristocrat. Their attacks were identical. Whenever one tried a direct attack, the other blocked it. Trying to make Ghislain lose his balance, Kaur yanked the boy's arm. But even with his provocations, Ghislain held his ground. And when Kaur tried to attack from behind, Ghislain dodged just in time. After that, Ghislain immediately tried to attack the mercenary leader, but Kaur also managed to dodge. Then Kaur decided to kick his opponent. Ghislain reacted, blocking the attack with his own leg, but the very next instant after blocking the attack, he felt a sharp pain in his leg. Kaur realized the guy was doing well, but it was weird that he'd won hundreds of times when even winning once was tough. After the attack, he told Ghislain that if a guy wants to brag, he better present something plausible. The crowd roared, cheering for Kaur and demanding he kill the aristocrat, but when Jillian shot a menacing glare at the mercenaries, they immediately shut up. After subduing the mercenaries, the man kept watching, reflecting on how the fight was going badly for Ghislain. The circle was too small even for one person, and mana was off limits, so everything came down to a person's weight and physical skills. His bound hands further restricted his mobility, and Ghislain could barely block Kaur's attacks, meaning Kaur could easily take the initiative in battle. But if things got too dangerous, Jillian was ready to step in. Grabbing Ghislain by the arm, Kaur prepared to strike his side with a knife. However, as he delivered the blow, Ghislain leaped over the guy and landed on his feet without a hitch, but at that moment, the pain in his leg flared up again. Now he was convinced that without mana, pain would just pile up in the body part he used to block a hit. Kaur could tell, judging by Ghislain's face, that things weren't looking good for him. He also found Ghislain's attempts at resistance pathetic, but this was the most stubborn noble Kaur had ever met, and Kaur was sure he knew what Ghislain was thinking right then. This fight was a manaless confession, so as long as Ghislain kept blocking attacks, the damage would only stack up. Ghislain's leg was already starting to cramp, clear as day on his face, but Kaur wanted the kid to keep fighting, because that would just make things more fun. Twirling the blade between his fingers, Kaur held it in a different way. Next, he threw a punch that Ghislain managed to block. When Kaur tried to strike his head, Ghislain dodged. Kaur shifted his hand's direction to follow Ghislain's head, and then Ghislain blocked his opponent's hand with his own. Taking the initiative, Kaur managed to block Ghislain's hand. Then he tried to kick, but Ghislain reacted, and just like last time, blocked the attack with his leg. As he did so, a sharp pain shot through his leg. Then Kaur declared it was time for them to finish this. Pointing the blade at Ghislain's neck, he was about to kill the kid. Just as Jillian had planned, he drew his axe. However, at that very instant, an ironic smile crept onto Ghislain's face. Unexpectedly, he managed to dodge Kaur's strike. Next, he shifted his stance, ready to strike. That's when the first blood was drawn in the duel. Seeing the wound, Kaur froze for a moment. Everyone was equally stunned to see it. Kaur landed a blow and tried to attack again, but Ghislain dodged. He tried another strike, but the guy dodged that too. Then Ghislain counterattacked, wounding Kaur in the chest. Kaur was cut a second time, throwing the crowd into confusion. The atmosphere started to shift as everyone had thought Kaur was dominating. Kaur attacked again and missed again, and right after that, Ghislain slammed into him with his shoulder. Then he landed multiple punches to his face and neck area. He raised his hand, then suddenly brought it down, plunging his knife into Kaur's hand. Enraged, Kaur started attacking furiously. He couldn't understand what had changed, because just moments ago Ghislain could barely stand. Jillian, constantly observing and analyzing, understood everything. Kaur's sudden movements had strained his muscles, and in his attempts to take the initiative, he was gradually losing mobility. Ghislain, on the other hand, acted calmly. Jillian never imagined that a weight advantage could be overcome like this. Suddenly, Kaur heard from his people that they were getting bored, so something had to be done about Ghislain. Ghislain remarked that Kaur's resilience was impressive. Many others would have given up and exhausted their mana by now, but Kaur retorted that anyone who broke the rules of this ritual had no right to exist in the mercenary world. With a smile, Ghislain admitted he was impressed. Kaur also suddenly admitted that, in terms of skill, he was inferior. However, he declared that the conditions for victory weren't limited to just that. He abruptly spun around and pulled Ghislain towards him. Anyone who crossed the circle's boundaries was declared the loser. No matter how skilled Ghislain was, if he was thrown out of the circle, he'd hit the ground. With these thoughts, Kaur was confident victory was his. However, Ghislain swiftly turned, changing the position of Kaur's free hand. In that instant, he almost touched the ground, but before that could happen, he landed a two-footed kick on Kaur. With his hand still bound, he used the momentum to swing back inside the circle. Kaur immediately started losing his balance. This gave Ghislain the opening to slam the mercenary leader to the ground. It was then revealed that Kaur had stepped outside the circle. Kaur was absolutely furious about losing the fight. Ghislain declared the victory was his. Kaur demanded to know who the boy was and where he'd learned such skills, but Ghislain, without missing a beat, shot back that Kaur had no respect for his master. He abruptly hauled Kaur to his feet. Kaur was bewildered, protesting that the fight was over. But Ghislain retorted that wasn't the case, because he hadn't stepped out of the circle yet, and he decided it was time to train his new subordinate. Immediately after, Kaur took a brutal punch to the face. He crashed to the ground again, leaving the spectators stunned by the sudden turn of events. Kaur tried to stop the boy, attempting to remind him of the rules, but he didn't even get to finish his sentence before Ghislain attacked him again. Then Ghislain mockingly asked if Kaur would also explain the rules of the battlefield. When Kaur tried to object, Ghislain cut him off, stating that the master's words were not to be doubted. Kaur wanted to call the guy crazy, but once again, he couldn't even finish the thought. The beatdown continued for a while. The others didn't know whether to intervene, so they just stood by. Then Kaur screamed, begging Ghislain to stop. As if hearing him, Ghislain yanked Kaur close and lifted the man off the ground. But Ghislain simply stated that Kaur still hadn't left the circle. Kaur then glared directly at Ghislain. Then, turning to his people, he commanded them to kill Ghislain. Without hesitation, they drew their weapons, ready to carry out the order. But just then, they saw Jillian standing before them. He declared in a severe tone that he would kill anyone who dared to lay a hand on Ghislain. Everyone was shaking with fear, rooted to the spot. Seeing this, Kaur realized just how dire his situation was. Trembling slightly, he turned his head to the side. He met Ghislain's eyes, a silent dare to keep going. Just as the kid threw another punch, about to connect with Kaur, he flashed an ironic smile. It was as if Kaur had stopped resisting, simply taking the blows. Right then, he recalled how spineless and pathetic the other nobles were. The moment he intimidated those arrogant narcissists, they'd immediately grovel at his feet. And Kaur took immense pleasure in emptying their pockets. That's how he earned his rabid dog reputation, by showing off his strength. But now he couldn't fathom how he'd screwed things up so badly with the rebellious Ghislain. The ground was slick with blood, and Kaur lay motionless, which deeply worried his people. Ghislain then wondered if that was enough. Suddenly, he spun around to the nearby mercenaries and ordered them to bring bandages and compresses. He explained that if Kaur didn't get help, he'd die. Hearing that, the mercenaries snapped back to reality, ready to follow Ghislain's orders. Silently, Ghislain turned his gaze back to the young man. He assessed the situation with a stern gaze. The mercenaries immediately jumped to obey Ghislain's command. In the mercenary world, the fist spoke louder than any law, and Ghislain knew how to assert his authority in the most effective way possible. When Kaur finally came to, Ghislain handed him a piece of paper. Pointing to the document, he told Kaur to sign it. At first, the mercenary didn't respond, just staring at Ghislain. Then he simply clicked his tongue in annoyance and signed the document. Once done, he carelessly tossed the paper back to Ghislain. However, Ghislain didn't like Kaur's attitude when he saw that. He found it disrespectful. Kaur involuntarily turned his head and asked Ghislain to take care of them. Ghislain agreed, gripping Kaur's hand. This instantly spooked the man, who was already battered, but Ghislain squeezed his hand and declared they were family now. And in his book, that meant they had to act as one. A few days later, the mercenaries gathered on the outskirts of Pertium's lands. The mercs couldn't figure out why they were meeting so early, grumbling that they barely had time to eat. Then, out of nowhere, one of them announced they were being hired by the heir to the Duchy of Pertium. Many started bickering about how they could just fleece the young lord, but there were also those who listened in silence. Suddenly, a mercenary piped up, saying they needed a representative to deal with this pseudo-employer. Many were surprised to see Gordon. He confirmed they hadn't messed up and added he couldn't help but notice how much effort they'd put into making their lives easier. The mercs shot back that last time. Some idiot made inappropriate demands, so things were going as expected, and Gordon suggested they simply not cross the line of reason. He offered himself as a representative who would subtly intimidate the employer, and the rest would simply have to agree with him. Many agreed, thinking that as long as Gordon was doing the talking, they'd have everything under control. But their conversation was abruptly cut short when someone announced that someone was heading their way. Then a man appeared on the horizon. It quickly became clear that the lone rider was Ghislain. They recognized the guy by his clothes and scoffed at him coming alone. Gordon waved his hand at the rest of the mercs and told them to handle the mood, and he himself would teach the noble a harsh lesson. However, just as he made his move, Ghislain's companions appeared on the horizon, right behind him. The guy had brought other mercs with him. Thanks to their elongated helmets, someone recognized them as the Cberus squad mercenaries. But it still wasn't clear what had happened to these rebels, seeing as they were acting so humble in front of the aristocrat. Before long, all the riders approached Gordon. Ghislain slowly scanned the mercs in front of him with an appraising gaze. Turning to Gordon, he asked if he was the leader. After getting a yes, Ghislain asked the mercenary his name. Looking at Ghislain, Gordon introduced himself, a bit hesitant. Hearing the name, Ghislain froze for a moment, his gaze still fixed on Gordon. Then, he lightly punched Gordon, saying that was impressive. Next, Ghislain introduced himself too, and the fact that he was actually the heir of Pertium shocked everyone. Turning his horse, Ghislain ordered all the soldiers to gather, and over his shoulder, he explained they were going to clear the forest of monsters. Soon, Ghislain was gearing up for the campaign, donning his armor. At that moment, he thought all preparations for the clearing were complete. A temporary base for the expedition was also set up, and supplies were provided, and the troops were ready. Once Ghislain received the equipment, he went out to his people. Then he asked Belinda for a head count. It turned out they had 150 mercenaries and 40 fighters from the Cberus squad. After hearing her, Ghislain asked if she had clearly relayed their position to Escovan. Belinda thought he'd object, but the knight even offered to cover their entry into the forest. Next, Ghislain ordered everyone to form a line. Pointing his finger at the forest, he declared they would have to clear that forest. The guy said everyone had surely heard what lurked in that forest. Monsters, secrets, and something even more terrifying. Upon learning their objective, many began to fear they wouldn't return alive. Belinda was outraged they were chattering during Gislin's speech and reprimanded the mercenaries. Gislin said he wasn't stopping anyone, but if they succeeded, he'd pay triple. Hearing that, no one could believe such a payment. Belinda was instantly furious because they had actually spent all their money on preparations, and Gislin replied he said it to motivate people, but he still knew that if they succeeded, it would all be worth it. Once again, the man turned to the maid and, with an ironic smile, asked if she believed him. With a heavy sigh, the girl replied that she had to. Kaur also chuckled, noting the promise was ridiculous and it wasn't clear how Gislin would get out of it. Then Gislin yelled out loud, addressing his soldiers. Waving his hand towards the forest, he ordered them to retreat. Soon everyone got to work, hacking away at the forest. There was a ton of work, so even Gislin got his hands dirty. After he cut through a tree trunk, he gave it a mighty kick to bring it down. He was thrilled to see sunlight finally piercing through the canopy. Turning to his crew, he ordered them to keep clearing the path. Ghislaine recalled reading in Dolphin's old notes that the forest was incredibly vast, and one day it would be possible to drive out all the evil spirits from it. But right now, the priority was money and carving a path straight to the deposit. And to thwart the greedy desires of Pertium's envious folk, this profit was absolutely crucial. Kaur noticed that even Gislin had decided to get his hands dirty and chop down trees. The mercenaries couldn't tell if he was setting an example or just showing off. Overhearing their chatter, Belinda snapped at them again, ordering them back to work. She was clearly annoyed by how the mercs were treating the job and Gislin. She then asked Gislin why he was working personally, especially since he'd hired so many people. They might start looking down on him. Gislin brushed it off, saying it didn't matter. The more hands on deck, the faster things would get done. Belinda didn't argue, but she realized it seemed like Gislin knew absolutely everything about that place. Kaur snickered, remarking that the lady was worried about the boss, and they were just dogs being led to hell. At that instant, Jillian spun around sharply and smacked Kaur with the piece of wood he was holding. Jillian kept walking, and Kaur indignantly asked the other men if he was looking for a fight. Watching them, Gislin mused that everything had gone smoothly so far. Delphine, who had conquered the kingdom, first focused on conquering this very forest. At first, Gislin hadn't understood why Delphine had chosen to focus on this particular spot, but he'd learned about the fossils through the notes and was able to prepare for today's expedition. But at the same time, this calm made Gislin start to worry. He only had knowledge, not experience, so he told everyone to stay vigilant. He also said this because the forest ahead was growing denser, and gradually people were starting to spread out further. As it grew darker, one mercenary thought it was already night, while another claimed the forest wasn't as scary as people said. They insisted it was probably just rumors. But as they chatted, Gordon suddenly stopped, staring ahead in surprise. After a brief silence, he finally turned to the others. Gordon reminded them of the obvious. They had cut down a massive number of trees to get this far. No one understood why he was saying this, but everyone confirmed his words. So Gordon turned to them, asking where the path back was. The moment they heard his question, their faces instantly darkened. Just then, Gislin's voice cut through, telling everyone to prepare. The instant he said that, every soldier drew their weapon, but some didn't react, merely asking why everyone was so tense. Gislin turned to Gordon, telling him that if he stayed there, he'd die. Frowning, Gislin told him to slowly back away. Gordon didn't argue. Still clutching the log, he began to turn. At that exact moment, he accidentally slammed the log into a nearby tree. Startled by the sharp crack, he dropped the log and crouched to the ground. The other soldiers were startled too, calling Gordon an idiot. But Gordon was the most terrified of all, spinning sharply towards the trees. However, nothing happened, and no further sounds broke the silence. But the others were already on high alert. Sensing something strange was afoot, Gislin remained silent, observing, waiting to see what would unfold next. Even in such a tense situation, some remained overconfident. One mercenary scoffed, saying the client got spooked by every little noise. Pointing to the trees, the mercenary declared there was nothing but trees ahead. Frowning, Ghislaine told the mercenary to back off too, otherwise they'd both die. But the mercenary questioned why Ghislaine was instigating fear, thinking he did it on purpose to control them more easily. However, in that instant, something thick coiled around his waist. Before he could even react, the man was violently yanked backward. Ghislaine had known all along that these monsters' presence couldn't be sensed. No one could have predicted the appearance of the entity destined to become food, not unless they immediately understood what stood before them. Ghislaine then revealed to everyone that the monster before them was an ant dino. It turned out these monsters had already surrounded them. Terrified by these monsters, the mercenaries immediately tried to escape. Everyone feared becoming their next meal, so they desperately tried to flee. Without ever looking away from the people, the monsters shot their branches out at them. In an instant, several mercenaries were snatched up. They were dragged straight into the monsters' gaping maws. The only one they couldn't get was Gordon, who miraculously clung to a rock. One of his comrades rushed over, telling him to hold tight while he tried to hack at the branch himself. He swung his axe at the branch and a loud crack echoed. Turns out the branch was fine, but the axe, not so much. Before anyone could react, Gordon lost his grip on the rock, and they started dragging him down. He screamed in terror, and the others could only watch, helpless. But just then, Ghislain charged in to help. Wielding his mana-infused sword, he sliced through the branch. Then, in a mid-air twist, he managed to slash the monster's eye. Blood gushed from its eye, and both he and Gordon tumbled to the ground. Everyone watched Ghislain's actions, quickly realizing the monster's eyes were their weak spot. Ghislain then roared, telling everyone to snap out of it. He ordered them to gather and raise their shields, forming an impenetrable wall against the vines. Ghislain commanded them to focus on defense and await his next orders. Moving swiftly, everyone immediately readied their shields. Meanwhile, Ghislain found Kaur and demanded to know where the oil lamps were. Once he confirmed the lanterns were present, he ordered them to be hurled at the monsters to set them ablaze. Meanwhile, the soldiers were starting to panic under the monsters' relentless gaze. Waiting for the perfect moment, Ghislain finally gave the command to launch the lanterns. At his command, they unleashed a volley of lanterns at the monsters. But to their shock, the monsters used their vines to swat the lanterns away. The mercenaries were stunned, realizing that at this rate, they'd never set the beasts on fire. As the last lantern fell, the monsters retaliated, lashing out with their vines towards the people. But just then, Ghislain sprang into action, easily severing the incoming vines. Belinda wasn't about to stand by idly either. Taking aim, she brandished her daggers and hurled them straight into a monster's eye. Ghislain then ordered Belinda and Jillian to help Cberus prepare for another lantern volley. Ghislain himself would draw the monster's attention. Belinda was worried about him, so she told the guy to be careful. When countless vines shot his way, Ghislain sliced through them with ease. But the monsters kept attacking, forcing Ghislain to stay on the move to avoid getting caught. As he pushed forward, he noticed the monster had legs. Everyone was shocked, thinking Ghislain would be trampled, but Ghislain reacted instantly, easily severing the monster's leg. Then he leaped and struck the monster right in the eye. While he was busy with one, all the others swarmed him. Turning to the soldiers, Belinda commanded them to throw the lamps down. They all reacted fast, hurling lamps the monsters couldn't snatch this time. Instantly, they burst into flames. The mercenaries were thrilled to see they'd hit their mark. Ghislain turned to them, telling them not to stop, to keep attacking. Soon after, the entire forest was engulfed in flames. The mercenaries were stunned that they were still managing to defeat the monsters. Yet at the same time, they feared the fire might spread throughout the whole forest. Gordon was also delighted that the wooden monsters were helpless against the fire. However, Ghislain warned them not to drop their guard, because this wasn't the end yet. And then he added that now the monsters would reveal their true forms. As soon as he said that, steam erupted from nowhere. Seeing the steam, everyone immediately assumed the monsters had managed to put out the fire. Meanwhile, Belinda and Jillian approached Ghislain. When Belinda asked what was happening, the boy explained that only the monsters' shells were immune to fire. And when the fire hit their watery core, steam burst forth. Revealing their true forms, the monsters opened their mouths and shrieked. Seeing the monsters were still alive, the soldiers were terrified. Ghislain drew the soldiers' attention, raising his sword and telling everyone to grab their weapons. Sharply lowering his sword and dispersing the steam, Ghislain added that the fight was about to begin. And then he charged forward himself. When everyone saw how bravely he charged, they were frozen in surprise. They thought it was easy to say fighting these monsters was easy. However, Kaur charged forward with the Cberus, rejoicing that they could finally join the battle. Gordon even saw his maid rush to the front, worried about Ghislain. At that moment, Jillian asked the mercenaries why they had frozen, and he firmly told everyone that this was Ghislain's order, meaning they had to trust and obey. Hearing this, the mercenaries were surprised, but then they decided to join the fight too, believing Ghislain would still find a solution. Since the monsters' shells were burned away, Ghislain said they could survive without mana. He told his men that before them were just massive scarecrows that could be killed with a single blow. The next few hours were chaotic. Ghislain understood that uncertainty would lead them to their deaths, and his task was to dispel the doubts among those who followed him. So he constantly pushed forward, to instill in people a faith capable of turning the impossible into possible. When the last monster fell, everything instantly went silent. Everyone was breathing heavily, whispering about how they had defeated those monsters and what would happen next. Without turning to the soldiers, a sound of heavy footsteps followed, and instantly all the soldiers lined up behind him. Ghislain said that even at the forest's entrance, there were many monsters. Hearing this, everyone was scared, but Ghislain simply told them to trust and follow him. The mercenaries froze, utterly awestruck by Ghislain. Then they pressed on, hacking their way through the forest. Monsters? They just fought them off. After each skirmish, Belinda tended to Ghislain's wounds. Suddenly, they stumbled upon a monster that looked like a giant rat. Seeing it, everyone panicked, wondering when the monster encounters would ever stop. But Kaur and Gillian didn't even flinch. They charged forward, taking point. In a flash, Kaur closed the distance and severed one of the rat's legs. The rat stumbled. Gillian quickly covered its fangs with her shield, and Ghislain delivered the finishing blow. Ghislain asked if everyone was safe, and they confirmed it. One mercenary then barked at the others to stick close to their employer if they didn't want to end up dead. Gillian noted their good progress, and Kaur chimed in, "Practice makes perfect." After another quick fight, Ghislain ordered everyone to keep chopping trees. But among them all, one mercenary was absolutely terrified. He looked at the others thinking, "These people are insane!" Before long, the mercenaries reached a lake. Seeing the water, they all rushed to it, but Belinda wasn't sure if it was safe. Ignoring her, Ghislain figured everything was going according to plan so far. This lake was the main landmark on their path, so they decided to set up camp there. Chatting amongst themselves, the thieves realized the last 2 nights had been unusually quiet. When Manos suggested they all just slip away quietly, the mercenaries were outraged. He tried to explain that risking their lives like this wasn't worth it. Life couldn't be bought with any amount of money. Gordon countered that according to their employer, so leaving now made no sense. But Manos was furious that everyone believed the guy. He assumed Ghislain just wanted to curry favor by forcing them to clear-cut the forest. Another mercenary pointed out they'd already received an advance, and a mercenary's job is to do what they're paid for. Manos conceded Ghislain fought well, but still believed they'd just been lucky. He was convinced that when things got too dangerous, Ghislain would just use them as cannon fodder. Everyone fell silent. Manos intended to keep sowing discord, arguing that trying to defeat the monsters alone would be suicide. But suddenly, a mercenary spoke up, saying that without their employer, they'd have been dead long ago. He then pointed at Ghislain. Ghislain himself had treated the mercenaries' wounds and given them advice on recovery. Belinda thought it would be better to keep the expensive medicine for herself, but Ghislain stated they brought the ointment to use it. After tending to one person, Ghislain called for the next. The mercenary asked if Ghislain would really spend expensive medicine on them if he was just going to use them as cannon fodder. The others also agreed there was nothing to suggest Ghislain would abandon them. Manos was livid. That mercenary had just ruined everything for him. Ghislain told the others to stop talking and get some rest. Then he turned to Gillian and Kaur. Kaur asked if he was all right, because if she were Ghislain, she'd have ripped Manos' tongue out. However, Ghislain told them to forget it. They had something more important to discuss. Ghislain revealed that, just as he'd predicted, ever since they entered the forest, monsters had attacked them day and night, but the last 2 nights had been eerily quiet. Hearing this, the others grew pensive. Gillian realized they had entered the territory of night monsters. Ghislain confirmed her suspicion, then turned to their quiet camp. He calmly stated they were in grave danger. Everything was calm, everyone asleep, when suddenly, a rustling sound broke the silence. Gordon's eyes snapped open at the sound. He saw a lamp flying straight at him. He reacted instantly, rolling away and avoiding injury. But then, he immediately saw and felt something on his shoulder. Everyone woke up to a loud scream. They saw Gordon wildly swinging an axe, trying to fend off something. He was trying to scare away the monsters he saw. As they rushed to Gordon, he frantically replied that the monster was right in front of him, but no one understood what he was talking about, telling him there was no monster there. Gordon looked back, utterly disbelieving. Everyone started to leave, but then other mercenaries arrived and declared this was no dream. One of them felt a strange presence and watched a lantern vanish into thin air. Soon, the other mercenaries gathered, buzzing about the bizarre occurrences that had plagued their night. One was certain they weren't alone out there, and Ghislain wholeheartedly agreed. The moment Ghislain appeared, everyone parted. He then commanded everyone to gather. As he laid out the plan inside the tent, all the mercenaries assembled outside. Gordon was stunned to learn they were completely surrounded by monsters, despite not having seen a single one. Ghislain explained this was the monster's specialty. He even suspected they'd been tracked since the lake. these were creatures that owned the night. The fowlers could merge with the shadows. The mercenaries gasped, hearing they moved in hundreds and devoured light itself. But Belinda now understood exactly why the lanterns were vanishing. Kaur decided it would be best to strike first. However, Belinda also questioned if they could simply afford to wait. Ghislaine retorted that attacking blindly would only provoke the monsters further, but Jillian was astonished to learn there was a way to defeat the creatures all at once. Belinda had already distributed the scrolls Ghislaine had prepared to every mercenary. Now Ghislaine was about to unveil their battle tactics. He explained that the fowlers were systematically destroying their lanterns, effectively restricting their positions. And since they were severely outnumbered, defending the entire territory was simply impossible. Jillian, however, quickly realized the camp was strategically positioned near the lake, meaning they weren't completely surrounded. The situation wasn't desperate after all, and Ghislaine firmly believed the initiative in battle was still theirs. Everyone was taken aback by this bold claim of initiative. Ghislaine then proposed dividing the squad into 3 groups. The defense team would hold their ground, the shield bearers and crossbowmen would form an impenetrable wall, preventing the enemy from ever reaching the center. At that precise moment, the combat unit would concentrate its forces and launch a devastating attack from the left flank. Converging with the central forces, Kaur mused that if the center held, their plan just might work. But suddenly Belinda cut everyone off. She reminded them that, according to Ghislaine, attacking in the dark was useless, while fighting these monsters was. For a tense instant, all eyes snapped to Ghislaine. After that, Kaur simply suggested using mana. Ghislaine, however, reassured the girl not to worry, for they had magic scrolls. In no time, everything was organized. The last lantern finally snuffed out, and the creatures started to close in. Taking a decisive step forward, Ghislaine recalled a crucial detail from Delphine's diary. The fowlers absolutely couldn't stand light, and when they were hit with light, on Ghislaine's command, everyone tore their scrolls. As they did, seeing this, the monsters looked up with palpable apprehension, and in the very next instant, they were engulfed by a blinding light. The monsters writhed in discomfort and roared, unable to bear it. The oppressive darkness began to recede, and everyone realized the monsters' true forms were about to be revealed. As the light faded, the crossbowmen reacted instantly to their approach, bracing themselves for the attack. They unleashed a volley of bolts, all while receiving stern orders to stand their ground until the very end. At that very moment, Ghislaine also prepared to make his move. He declared to everyone that they could now clearly see the monsters' true forms. Then, immediately, everyone plunged into the fray, and a brutal battle erupted. Spearheading the assault, Ghislaine was the first to strike down the monsters. He knew the fowlers could merge with the darkness, but they were physically frail. With that in mind, he ordered every single monster to be wiped out at all costs. Jillian nimbly dodged their relentless attacks. Meanwhile, however, there were simply too many for him to handle alone. But Belinda was right there, ready to cover him. Her mission was also to carve a path through the monster ranks. After her attack, Belinda turned to Ghislaine, moving with lightning speed, ready to strike down the monsters. With a single sweeping strike of his sword, Ghislaine understood that Pertium's best warriors were now with him, and the soldiers obeyed his orders without question. They killed many monsters, but there were still plenty of enemies left. The mercenaries couldn't figure out where all these monsters were coming from. They couldn't keep up with the defense anymore, and the monsters caught up to them. However, that's when Ghislaine and the others arrived. After slaying the monsters, Ghislaine praised his soldiers. Seeing the young man, everyone was thrilled by his arrival, knowing that with him they certainly wouldn't be lost. Immediately, Ghislaine ordered them to expand their formation and surround the monsters from all sides. Under enemy pressure, the fowlers started trying to escape. Seeing this, the mercenaries were surprised. Ghislaine frowned, realizing the fowlers hadn't waited for an ambush. They were smart, so he ordered Belinda to find their leader, who should have horns on his head. She suggested simply letting the monsters go, but Ghislaine replied that they would keep chasing them until they were exhausted, and since they couldn't handle another fight, Ghislaine wanted to end it all now. Hearing this, Belinda was silent at first, as Ghislaine had changed so much, but she immediately snapped out of it and accepted the order. She launched a grappling hook that wrapped around a tree branch. She managed to propel herself off the ground and soar into the air. This was enough to see all the monsters. She finally found what she needed. She immediately aimed and wanted to tie him up with a rope. Thanks to her precision, the rope wrapped perfectly around the leader's neck. And then, Hearing her, Ghislaine prepared to kill the leader. With a swift move, the blow was severe. In its last moments, the monster screamed in pain. When the other fowlers saw this, they also screamed, but didn't attack Ghislaine. With the leader dead, Ghislaine ordered the other monsters to be eliminated. Everyone rushed forward, unwilling to yield to anyone in military merit. Their fight continued until dawn. Only then did Ghislaine strike down the last fowler. Everyone fought well. Upon learning of the victory, everyone cheered with joy. Everyone was extremely happy with this victory. Those closest to Ghislaine asked him if he was okay. Ghislaine also praised them. He also ordered the Cberus squad to scatter the monster corpses around the camp to scare off other monsters. Jillian explained to Kaur that if the fowlers were one of the most powerful creatures, then this was how they protected themselves. However, Kaur was annoyed because Jillian treated him as if he were stupid. Ghislaine reflected that they had already been in the forest for over 10 days, and now that they had defeated the fowlers, all that remained was to reach the runes. With that thought, he gazed at the sunrise, but he couldn't believe that this was the end of their journey. Belinda then reported that 3 people were missing, but the Cberus squad had suffered no casualties. Smiling, Kaur said that, coming from a commander like that, it wasn't surprising. However, it's unclear where the 3 people went. Gordon realized Manos was missing, but they also didn't find any body. Another mercenary said that escaping a fight was totally in Manos' spirit. In fact, it didn't even surprise him. The mercenaries told Manos that if they hadn't fled, they surely would have died in that battle. And when the others wanted to slow down, Manos said they needed to run faster while the others distracted the monsters. But at that instant, everyone stopped. They ignored Manos' words, and that annoyed the mercenary. But finally, one of them managed to raise a hand and point into the distance. When Manos turned, he saw a massive monster staring at them. Manos was utterly horrified to see it. After all, it was the biggest monster he had ever seen. Without averting its gaze, meanwhile, Ghislaine's team kept advancing. Kaur was suddenly surprised to see everyone working without asking questions. After all, Jillian pestered Kaur again. Kaur said it would be a shame if the mercenaries were dismissed at the end of the mission, but Ghislaine stated that he would hire them as his personal guard. It was believed that mercenaries couldn't defeat a regular army. However, thanks to their recent experience, then Kaur's people arrived and reported that they had scattered corpses everywhere. Kaur observed that it seemed to be working, as they hadn't encountered any monsters yet. But Ghislaine was constantly on high alert and hoped his worries weren't in vain. At that moment, Belinda approached him. She had to report if there was anything ahead, and it turned out she really had discovered something. Hearing this, he immediately ordered everyone to advance as fast as possible, and just like that, they reached their goal. Seeing this, the mercenaries were speechless. Ghislaine calmly declared this was their mission's objective. Before them, at last, Kaur was astonished to find something so precious here, and Jillian reminded him that every single detail had been meticulously planned. Belinda asked how Ghislaine knew. Many couldn't believe they'd seen runes in such quantities. But suddenly, a man appeared before them, declaring they wouldn't pass. Ghislaine grew suspicious at the sight of him. The man, after that he collapsed, leaving the mercenaries worried. They recognized Manos and rushed towards him. However, Ghislaine immediately stopped them, and then the guy told everyone to fall back. With that, began to disperse the smoke in the area. When the smoke cleared, everyone saw countless bones scattered across the ground. Witnessing such a sight, everyone was shocked and wondered what could have happened there. Everyone grew apprehensive, and Ghislaine said they'd have to sweat to get those stones. After all, judging by the size, a very powerful monster was behind this. However, Ghislaine couldn't recall any mention of this in Delphine's diary. Turning around, he intended to give an order, but Ghislaine didn't have time to finish speaking because he saw an enormous python staring right at him. Without giving anyone a chance to react, Ghislaine ordered everyone to scatter. In that instant, Ghislaine had already charged forward. However, leaping onto the snake's body, he propelled himself with his legs and attacked its head directly. Yet it turned out this powerful attack left very few marks. The others were surprised that not even magic could break through its scales. Meanwhile, the python tried to swallow the man again, but Ghislaine retaliated with venomous fangs, spraying poison everywhere. Seeing the venom, Ghislaine managed to dodge the splashes. However, when he turned back to the python, he saw it was about to strike. In that moment, he managed to react and block the blow. Yet the python still pinned him to the ground with its tail. Seeing this, Belinda began to worry about the young man. The serpent continued to thrash. The mercenaries grew cautious and tried to dodge its blows. Belinda and Jillian also helped people escape. The only sounds that reached Ghislaine were the screams of the mercenaries trying to escape. Now he understood who owned those stones, but he hadn't expected the owner to be a real python. Pythons usually stayed deep in the forest, but now he knew they wouldn't hold back. At the same time, after all, if they retreated now, the entire journey would lose its meaning. Ghislaine told the python not to interfere with him. After awakening his mana cores, Ghislaine prepared for battle. The python attacked him violently, but the boy managed to dodge, dodging its jaws, and then he managed to cut one of the snake's eyes. However, as soon as he did that, the python tried to attack him with its tail in response, but the snake's weight was too much for him. In that instant, the python continued to attack, but Ghislaine managed to block the attacks every single time. He didn't care how remote his chances of winning were. After all, his sense of duty wouldn't allow him to stop this important battle. In that moment, all eyes were on Ghislaine. Everyone watched intently as he, alone, the fight quickly drained the young man's strength. However, he and the python remained motionless. Ghislaine knew his mana would run out before he could kill the snake. Then he heard voices behind him. Everyone approached Ghislaine. Belinda urged Ghislaine to retreat, promising they would hold off the python. But Ghislaine ordered them to stay back, which surprised everyone. They asked him, confused, why he had said that. Jillian also asked what that meant. Ghislaine explained he couldn't protect them from this kind of monster now, and he couldn't afford to lose all of them either. When asked about himself, Ghislaine said he could handle the python alone. Belinda realized that just being alive was already a miracle, but she couldn't grasp why Ghislaine was pushing so hard. At that instant, the python opened its mouth again. When that happened, Ghislaine yelled for everyone to run, but to his surprise, Ghislaine hadn't expected the mercenaries to defend him. Then they told him they would fight together. The mercenaries declared they'd never met an employer as noble as Ghislaine. Kaior also suggested simply killing the snake to keep all the treasures for themselves. Jillian offered to distract the snake and create an opening in its defense. They all asked him to trust them. Hearing this, Ghislaine remained silent. Then, to everyone else's surprise, he began listing the snake's benefits. It was huge, venomous, had tough scales, and if they missed their attack, they'd die instantly. Belinda was moved by this. Ghislaine continued, saying the snake now had a wound and one of its eyes was damaged. And after this expedition, they were bound to return together. Hearing this, the mercenaries' fighting spirit ignited, and the serpent, the soldiers held their defense. Kaor managed to wound the snake. In pain, at that instant, before the snake had time to orient itself, Ghislaine had already aimed for its second eye. The python had no time to react. Ghislaine knew that even with a perfect strategy, things could still go wrong. But if he gave in, everyone would die, and he couldn't afford to let that happen. Blinded, the snake shot upwards, ready to finish what it had started. He carried a huge responsibility because he knew the future. But in that instant, the python swallowed the man whole. At this sight, everyone's heart sank for Ghislaine. However, a sword immediately pierced the snake's skin as he began to move, and just like that, Ghislaine, covered in venom, managed to escape the snake's maw. When the others saw this, Ghislaine was the future of Pertium. Meanwhile, back at the castle, they were furious because the guy acted like a lord and did whatever he pleased. Another count questioned the point of their outrage if the young man had already been in the forest for 2 weeks. If Scoven hadn't lied, they would have stopped Ghislaine ages ago. Lord Pertium silently listened to his advisor's indignation. He remained silent, but his face looked incredibly grim as he thought of his son. Suddenly, someone burst in and addressed the man. The knight declared that everyone should see with their own eyes. Everyone was stunned to hear from him that Ghislaine had returned. Meanwhile, the young man was already on his way to their castle. Before long, he found himself in the same room as the other counts. Everyone, including Ghislaine's father. First, Ghislaine greeted his father. In response, Ghislaine apologized but said he had to do it. But others were outraged, not considering that a valid reason to disobey the order. The knight was incensed, arguing it wasn't just about Ghislaine's life, but also the fact that monsters could emerge from the forest and start attacking people. But Ghislaine retorted that he was alive, and the monsters hadn't invaded. Hearing this, suddenly one of them asked if Ghislaine found this amusing. And then he added that since everything turned out fine, still, he believed there was no excuse for it. Grabbing the paper, turns out the Count got worried after Ghislaine's visit to Amelia, so he found out what had happened there. And so, which is why he broke off the engagement and stopped helping them. Ghislaine thought to himself that the letter didn't seem fake. He figured Amelia was willing to ally even with the enemy just to destroy Ghislaine, but now this meant he couldn't pressure Amelia anymore. If Ghislaine had been late, he would have been trapped inside the mansion. The man asked if Ghislaine had anything to say. Others demanded the money be returned to the Riefolds, complaining that such a sum would have lasted them ages. Ghislaine then replied that he'd already spent it all. He explained the money was for an expedition to the monster forest. As soon as he said that, silence fell. One of those present, Ghislain, said he was sorry and had no excuses. Then, suddenly, he was grabbed by the collar. They demanded to know what kind of heir he was if he'd destroyed the county with his own hands. Someone else also stepped in, declaring Ghislain wasn't an heir anymore, but a criminal. But Ghislain cut them off. His father asked him what that meant. Then Ghislain called Belinda inside. As the girl placed something on the table, when the box was opened, everyone's expression changed, and Ghislain presented everyone with high-quality runestones. When they saw them, no one could believe it. The men, stunned, assumed Ghislain had bought the stones with Amelia's money, but Ghislain replied that he'd found a stone deposit in the forest. One man retorted that the money spent on that stone wouldn't be enough to maintain the mansion anyway. Ghislain chuckled and agreed it was true. However, that was far from the only ace up his sleeve. Outside, with mercenaries hauling stones, everyone was stunned by how much stone the young man had extracted in just 2 weeks. Belinda confirmed it all came from the expedition. But besides the stones, Ghislain declared that all actions were for the good of the county. They told Ghislain's father this would be enough to sustain them. Everyone was shocked at the idea of no longer needing to fight for survival. Just then, someone placed their hands on Ghislain's shoulders, and then they started praising him, asking if he'd gotten tired during all this. Suddenly, he told them he had several conditions. He demanded the release of Scoven and Ricardo, as they were simply following orders, and access to the monster forest should be free for everyone. Any unnecessary rumors would harm the county. And finally, the guy said he'd lead the service himself and recruit mercenaries, but they found it unacceptable that Ghislain wanted to form his own army. They tried to explain that Ghislain should be begging for forgiveness right now, but instead, he was demanding total freedom. Ghislain shot back that he was creating conditions where they wouldn't need to depend on Rayford anymore. And if these minor issues they were raising delayed the work, it would negatively impact the county's finances. Next, they turned to Ghislain's father. Just then, the mercenaries approached and greeted Ghislain. Jillian asked for more instructions as the loading was almost complete, and Kaur asked what they should do with the python's remains. Ghislain told them to separate the venom, blood, meat, and skin from each other to prevent decomposition. Randolph stated that Ghislain's number of mercenaries was impressive, but they couldn't understand how young Ghislain was able to unite such strong people. Looking at his son, the Lord remained silent. Just then, he told his son it must have been tough to subdue the mercenaries. Then he heard Ghislain's reply. Without mercenaries, nothing would have worked. So he turned around and told everyone to go back. He told Ghislain that this time he'd turn a blind eye, but he warned Ghislain about the consequences if he disobeyed orders again. Ghislain thanked his father for that. Finally, the mansion would belong to Ghislain, and that it truly held the spirit of the North Wolf. The North Wolf was a title given to those who defended the northern border of the Kingdom of Luthania. Ghislain's father had no one by his side. His military might was insignificant, but he kept fighting, staying far from his wife and son. And as a reward for his efforts, the work was done. Ghislain told everyone to get ready, as they could leave at any moment. But they asked Ghislain not to rush, because he needed to rest. Belinda said they worked hard to remove the poison from his body, but then the guy turned to her, and he said he was counting on her. Then he walked away from them and headed forward. The news that they extracted the stones would spread quickly. That's why Ghislain wanted to strengthen their power, to become so strong that no one would even think of attacking them. However, with that thought, he collapsed, out of strength. Soon, the news spread throughout the entire region. The partial development of the monster forest was confirmed. It was necessary to start a war against the Degrades. There was a lot of discussion about this at the meeting. It wasn't known how many of their own people still remained in those lands. Then someone reported that there were 2 vassals and a knight. If the Degrade prince died in Pertium territory, it would trigger a territorial war. Sam was in charge of this operation. Upon hearing this, everyone was surprised, as they didn't expect their trump card to be revealed so soon. Someone objected that such a decision seemed too hasty. Then they were told that everything had changed because of the monster forest. Dolphin was the one calling the shots. Desmond then told everyone to prepare for war. He also asked if anyone else was aware of the current situation. Amelia went ballistic when she found out what had happened. She buried her face in her assistant and sobbed. She even had to humble herself before her father to get him to stop supporting Pertium. But he just told her she didn't seem like herself. Hearing this, the girl sighed, agreeing she had given in too much to her emotions. But she accepted that what was done couldn't be undone. The knight then asked Amelia to give the order. She stated that, with the extracted stones, Pertium would soon be out of its financial crisis. But the main issue was they still hadn't managed to sell the stones. They had only recently discovered them. Amelia said there was only one place in the north where they could sell the stones, and it was a massive crimson tower. The stones were crucial for research, and magic towers took their supply seriously. Now the target wasn't Ghislain anymore, but the workers transporting the stones. The man replied that there were 2 towers in the north, so it made no sense to focus energy on just one. Amelia countered that Ghislain wouldn't get involved with that tower, as they had already lost their splendor. Now she was going to take absolutely everything from Ghislain. Meanwhile, the man remained unconscious. In his sleep, he remembered what had happened. He recalled the moment he found himself inside the python. Before swallowing its prey, Mana dissipated the venom on contact, but the toxic smoke didn't disappear. As a result, Ghislain fought to stay conscious. What was dear to him depended on this expedition, and if he couldn't avoid the poisoning, the venom that had entered his body was concentrated in his mana, and he aimed to neutralize it by rotating the mana in his core. Ghislain managed to convert the poison into an alternative fuel capable of withstanding a mana explosion. At that instant, the guy woke up, immediately realizing he was alive. As he got up, he wondered what had happened, his consciousness still blurry. Then, his gaze fell upon his sister. The moment Helena saw him awake, she explained that Ghislain had gone out, and when he returned, he'd lost consciousness. But now, Helena was just thrilled he was okay. For a moment, Ghislain remained silent, utterly surprised. The moment he tried to speak, the girl abruptly pushed him, then bolted out of the room, screaming that Ghislain was awake. Ghislain frowned, realizing he'd been lying there like that for 2 whole days. He tried to resist as much as possible, but his young body just couldn't handle the strain. But even so, his body was in surprisingly good shape, and such regeneration should have been impossible in just 2 days. His regeneration had improved, and his mana volume had skyrocketed. To Ghislain, it felt like the very nature of mana itself had fundamentally changed. He immediately figured the mana had merged with the python's energy. He'd never known anyone could get stronger this way, and it turned out the life-threatening risk was totally justified. If Ghislain played his cards right, he could become dozens of times stronger. But first, he decided to get back to business. In 2 days, everyone should already know about the stones. So Ghislain decided he needed to urgently gather some mercenaries. Just then, and Ghislain told Belinda to come in. But it wasn't just Belinda who walked in. His father was right behind her. His dad was clearly overjoyed that Ghislain had finally woken up. Ghislain, however, was completely taken aback to see him. The man went on, explaining that Belinda had told him all about his battle with the python, and he was relieved Ghislain was safe. Belinda still concerned, given how suddenly he'd lost consciousness. But Lord Pertium cut them off, telling Ghislain, "We need to talk." Turns out he had some kind of request for Ghislain. Ghislain was more than a little surprised to hear it. Soon enough, Ghislain was in this situation for the very first time. He used to actively avoid his father to escape his lectures. His father apologized for calling him earlier, but Ghislain just brushed it off, saying it was fine. So he asked what his father wanted from him. His father just stared at him in silence. Then, just as silently, he looked away. Remembering his mother's words, Ghislain wondered if this was what she meant. She told him ages ago that his father wasn't exactly the most open person. Ghislain had been surprised she'd spoken about his father like that. His mother continued, constantly burying his true feelings. The only exception was the moment he declared his love for her. That's why she'd asked Ghislain to understand his father, even if he came across as cold. After all, he was just a man who didn't know how to express his feelings. Ghislain tensed up when his father told him to raise his sword, but he didn't object, readying himself for a fight. Without a single signal, they clashed. Lord Pertium attacked first. Then they both began a constant dance of maneuvering and counterattacking. Ghislain expertly parried his father's relentless attacks. Creating some distance, they paused for a moment. Ghislain noticed his father's sword was incredibly heavy. This blade was powerful enough to crush countless enemies, yet slender enough to allow for agile defense. It became an especially effective weapon in the hands of a seasoned warrior. The Lord struck with all his might, but Ghislain parried the blow, ready to unleash his own counterattack. In response, the rivals exchanged cautious glances. In the end, both were on the verge of victory. They both managed to point their blades at each other, but it ended in a stalemate. His father then remarked that Ghislain had grown so much. Ghislain thanked him, but tensed up, bracing himself for whatever his father was about to say. My father told Ghislain to ease up on the pressure when crossing swords with someone. Otherwise, Ghislain pondered this, but then it suddenly hit him. This was the first time anyone had officially given him a lesson. His swordsmanship was forged in battle. It was instinctive. He'd never had proper training, so he might have missed a few things. Ghislain had always relied solely on himself, but it felt good when someone taught him. Reflecting on this, the man looked sternly at his son, saying it was a reprimand. Regardless of Ghislain's achievements, he wanted his son to follow the rules. Ghislain understood that otherwise, everything would descend into chaos. In the end, my father said Ghislaine had changed a lot. Ghislaine's eyes widened. Ghislaine couldn't stop thinking about the duty that fell upon him. It was obvious he had to take care of the people on his lands. But then he remembered his father had a request. There was silence because his father didn't dare tell him. But in the end, he still awkwardly asked if Ghislaine had any extra cash. The mercenary camp was near the Forest of Monsters. When Ghislaine returned, he asked how everyone was doing. Everyone replied in unison that everything was going wonderfully well. Everyone asked about his health, but he was already feeling better. Suddenly, he asked Jillian about Rachel's health. The man didn't answer immediately. He hadn't expected his daughter to recover. Ghislaine was genuinely happy for him. And then he decided to tell them something. He said their estate was in grave danger. When everyone heard this, ultimately, how they wanted to spark a war that way, and how he found the Prince of Gradia on the brink of death. As for the forces targeting Pertium, he suspected they'd been tailed for ages. Now, Belinda finally understood the rush, and Kaor remarked that Ghislaine was anything but boring. Jillian said the estate was a perfect target now. It was vulnerable, yet it held a lot of valuable resources. Ghislaine agreed with that. Belinda urged them to tell everyone Asapi. Ghislaine refused. Then a spy had likely been among the vassals for ages, and now that they'd discovered the stone, an attack was surely imminent. He stated that a tough battle awaited them. A heavy silence fell over them all. Kaor told Ghislaine to just give the order. He added with a grin that Ghislaine wouldn't be bored with them. Jillian declared they had already entrusted their lives to him. They were ready to follow him to the very end. Belinda agreed, wanting to protect Ghislaine too. He chuckled at their enthusiasm. His greatest enemy was Duke Dolphin, and Desmond and Amelia. Ghislaine told everyone they were going to the Scarlet Flame Tower. Belinda questioned why not the Crimson Tower, which offered better rates. Ghislaine replied they'd face fewer issues with the Scarlet Flame Tower. Jillian agreed, reasoning they'd likely be attacked. Ghislaine knew the Scarlet Flame Tower was currently trying to restore its former glory. But there was another crucial reason he'd chosen that particular tower. There was a wizard in the Scarlet Flame Tower. The girl waited for the light her teacher said would shine upon them. Before long, the mercenaries were taken aback by the towering structure. The city itself was a shock, on a completely different level compared to Pertium. Mages were a common sight on the streets. The mercenaries stared. The mages' expressions darkened the moment they spotted the mercenaries. And then, in unison, they unleashed their magic. Everyone watched as the mages simply vanished. The mercenaries gasped in shock. Ghislaine quickly realized they were far from welcome. Despite the ominous atmosphere, Belinda noted the tower itself looked perfectly fine. Ghislaine agreed. Everything appeared normal. But soon, everyone commented on the tower's sheer size, but they finally reached its base. Suddenly, Belinda noticed a glaring absence. No gatekeepers. Instead, armor lay haphazardly strewn across the ground. Suddenly, a voice boomed from above. In that instant, the mages flat out forbade the travelers from entering the tower. Next, the armor was clearly controlled. Ghislaine declared to the mages that the heir of Pertium stood before them. He then requested to speak with the person in charge of trade, but the mages retorted that they weren't buying a single thing. Belinda was outraged. They hadn't even bothered to glance at their wares. The mage scoffed, and with that, they decided to expel the travelers. The girl, now furious, snapped at the mages, demanding they come down immediately. They asked Ghislaine what to do. He then asked the mage if they were absolutely sure they wouldn't buy it. After revealing the stone, the mage was stunned by the stone, and seeing its light, he was instantly convinced it was a runic stone. He then correctly guessed exactly what they had brought to sell. Ghislaine with a smirk, they immediately apologized for their behavior. The sales manager introduced himself to Ghislaine. Ghislaine stated they had a massive shipment, so he needed someone to take charge of the deal. The manager was shocked to hear he was asking for someone of equal or higher standing than the Tower Lord. He agreed to relay this to the bishop and had the guests escorted to another room. Belinda, with an ironic smile, questioned if it was truly worth it for them to insult other people's lands. But suddenly a loud noise erupted. When Ghislaine questioned it, he was told such sounds were normal during magical research. When the man opened the door, the room was filled with thick smoke. He immediately grew furious. He scoffed, saying she didn't even know how to do magic, yet still demanded a researcher position. The mages couldn't fathom how they could accept a girl like her. Breathing heavily, she declared that she, too, had the right to visit the laboratory. But he merely smirked upon hearing she was also a mage. Suddenly, but then, she should be able to use protection spells. And now, he wanted her to block the attack. Seeing this, the girl was instantly terrified. At that very moment, the girl reached out, desperate to cast a protection spell, but she couldn't, and fear consumed her. Just then, with a flick of his sword, Ghislaine managed to repel the attack. The mages were stunned when they saw him. Ghislaine, clearly annoyed by the tower's methods, asked if this was how they conducted research. The Lord was shocked to hear they were running low on runes. He fumed that this would only widen the chasm between them and the Crimson Tower, reminding them he'd already ordered reserve stones. The mages muttered to themselves that every time they wanted to spend money, but somehow the cash always ended up on entertainment and luxury. Another mage pointed out that the ruler of that tower was in the 7th circle, while theirs was only in the 6th, but the bishop had forbidden him from bringing it up. The ruler was furious because his rival seemed to have bought up all the stones in the region. Just then, the manager burst in. The bishop was outraged by the abrupt interruption, but the manager informed them that a massive shipment of stones had just been delivered. Everyone was utterly stunned by the news. Meanwhile, the mage was battling Ghislaine, but Ghislaine couldn't care less. He effortlessly parried all the mage's attacks. Then, a huge jet of flames was aimed at him, but Ghislaine easily swatted that away too. The onlookers were mesmerized by his skills. Suddenly, something began to wrap around him. Unnoticed, Belinda had snuck up behind him and demanded how he dared attack their master. Just then, the bishop arrived, demanding to know what kind of mess they'd made. He saw his student being tied up by a guest, and another drawing a sword. The girl looked a bit alarmed at seeing him, and Ghislaine told Belinda to let the man go. That mage was overjoyed to see the Lord. He scurried towards the man, claiming he'd been attacked. Trembling, he whined that the fragile Vanessa shouldn't go to the lab, as she might get hurt there. Belinda scoffed, calling him a little girl. Vanessa stated she needed a lab. Ghislaine watched silently for now. Turns out, Vanessa was a real nightmare. Ghislaine was surprised that a monster like her had gone through such tough times. The Lord was enraged. Not only had they trespassed into his tower, Belinda asked what they were supposed to do, seeing as they'd been threatened. Ghislaine apologized to the Lord for the late greeting and introduced himself as the heir of Pertium. He then added that he wanted to sell them stones. Upon hearing this, the bishop was suddenly taken aback. The student was also surprised by Ghislaine's arrival to sell stones. Ghislaine explained his men were outside, guarding the goods. He invited the mages to see for themselves, and they stepped outside. They were astonished by the sheer quantity of stones. The mages couldn't fathom where this guy had gotten so many. They asked what they should do with such goods. Finally, he beamed and declared it was simply a gift from the heavens. After all, with this, they could bypass the Crimson Tower once and for all. That's what he thought. But then he claimed there wasn't much product and the quality was poor. Kaur was furious that his wares were being belittled. Vanessa pointed out that even a single cart would last them several weeks, but the Lord told her to shut up. He sneered that she only ever made life difficult for everyone. Ghislaine merely watched. The ruler then asked his mages if they agreed with him. The mages concurred that upon closer inspection, the stones didn't look very good. Belinda was outraged by this, stating they'd gone through hell and back to get those stones. But the mages retorted, what difference did it make to them if the stones were hard to get? Ghislaine assumed they wouldn't buy. Then the Lord exchanged glances with his mages, and they quickly said they were still willing to buy such a batch. The Lord declared he was feeling generous today, and thus would buy all their goods. But Ghislaine cut him off. He ordered Kaur to unload one cart for them, adding that they only wanted to sell a single cart anyway. The mages were left in an awkward situation because of this. Kaur chuckled, saying he'd completely forgotten about that, and ordered his people to move out. When the Lord got indignant, Ghislaine replied that they'd had a misunderstanding due to his subordinate's mistake. He explained they'd stopped there to earn some travel money. Hearing this, Ghislaine then let out a little chuckle, and just like that, they found themselves at the negotiation table. The Lord introduced him to the Tower Elders, all of whom had reached the 5th circle. Ghislaine replied that it was impressive, but he expected nothing less from the 2nd Tower of the North. The Lord said Ghislaine had probably heard rumors about them, but they were false. Belinda didn't understand why she should provoke him again. The bishop decided to cut to the chase and discuss the price. Ghislaine then held up 2 fingers. He wanted double the market price. All the mages were outraged that he didn't know how things worked. The Lord also told the boy that this was the wrong approach to negotiations, but Ghislaine shot back that the tower itself deserved double the price. The mages were once again outraged by the guy's insolence. The Lord calmly addressed the boy, as he was just a thoughtless youth. Ghislaine listened calmly and remained silent. The bishop continued, saying the boy was young, so they were willing to forgive his mistakes. When he offered to pay a price slightly above market value, he said he saw no interest in the product, so they would simply leave. Then he turned around, leaving the ruler flustered. He tried to stop the man. Hearing that the Lord was just nervous, Ghislaine gave him a little chuckle. The others watched calmly from the sidelines. In the end, the bishop agreed to buy it for double the price. Ghislaine was satisfied but firmly stated, only 1 cart. The bishop said they were ready to buy everything, as they hadn't brought it all for nothing. Ghislaine said the Crimson Tower would agree to triple the price, making it more profitable to go there instead. The Lord said Ghislaine had already pushed his patience to the limit. Ghislaine then started to leave. The man yelled that he'd buy it for triple the price. This made Ghislaine smile. He was happy they'd finally understood each other. The Lord told the boy to sit tight while he fetched the money. Inside, the man knew he held a high position, but he was dancing to the boy's tune. Suddenly, Ghislaine said he hadn't told them about all his conditions. The Lord then started losing his temper, and Ghislaine demanded Vanessa be handed over to him. Hearing this, the bishop was stunned by such a demand, and Ghislaine reiterated that he wanted her to become his personal mage. One night, the men were sitting around a campfire roasting meat. One of them said it would be worth doing it themselves. The other was outraged by this, and his anger forced the first to remain silent. Suddenly, he asked if Ghislaine knew anything about her. There was an incident where the northern part of Luthania was set ablaze by a sorcerer. Ghislaine thought the scarlet disaster of the 7th circle of magic sounded impressive. The man said that at one point, the girl completely lost her mind and started studying mana cultivation, even though she was already a mage. She's been wreaking havoc and destroying lords' homes. Hearing this, Ghislaine fell silent. Suddenly, he realized she'd reached the 7th circle through cultivation, not the traditional way. He thought it sounded tempting and suggested Claude recruit the girl. But that never happened because the girl hadn't learned to control her magic. But even so, she managed to reach the 7th circle. This time, Ghislaine was determined to recruit her. All his companions thought the girl didn't look strong, but the mages were eager to agree, because Vanessa was useless to them anyway. The Lord agreed, and Ghislaine added that they needed mages of the 3rd circle or higher. This surprised the man, and Ghislaine went on to say that a territorial war was coming soon. This left everyone tense. Ghislaine demanded, in addition to Vanessa, several other 3rd circle mages. Everyone stared at the young man in shock, and the Lord was gradually consumed by rage. At that moment, he couldn't stand such mockery of himself. The force emanating from him shattered the window panes, and then he turned to the guy and asked if Ghislaine considered him a fool. After all, mages assigned to the tower weren't allowed to participate in territorial wars. Now he felt Ghislaine had insulted their tower. Due to this pressure, Ghislaine, though, kept his cool. He stared intently at the Lord and told the man he'd regret it. He added that there were dozens of times more stones in his territory than what they'd brought. The mages were stunned to hear this. Ghislaine claimed this info had already spread across the entire north. The man retorted that anyone looking for easy money would soon flock to them. Ghislaine said they needed the tower's help to solidify their position. The man's eyes widened when Ghislaine mentioned custom deliveries for their tower, adding that it was only a matter of time until the Scarlet Tower claimed its rightful place at the top. The Lord glared at the outstretched hand, a grimace of distaste twisting his features. But after a moment of deliberation, he finally agreed with Ghislaine. Immediately after, he informed Alfoy that everything was settled. He told the young man he was sending him to lead the squad for the common good. The young man was flattered by such praise. The Lord told Alfoy he'd definitely need this experience, and that he also had to ensure Ghislaine didn't trade these stones with anyone else. He asked the young man to be patient for just a year. Alfoy remained silent for a moment, but then he agreed with the bishop. But it wasn't long before he seemed to start regretting it. The moment they arrived in Pertium, the other mages assessed the castle, but Alfoy stayed silent. He thought the place was nothing but a dump, but agreed out of respect for the Lord. Alfoy introduced himself to Ghislaine, who replied that there would be plenty of work for the mages. As Ghislaine looked around, Alfoy was silently fuming that the villager considered him his servant. Suddenly, Ghislaine turned to Alfoy and demanded, "Where's Vanessa?" Alfoy replied she was probably somewhere in the back, with the luggage. Just then, a girl appeared, burdened with several bags. She looked utterly exhausted from the journey. Almost collapsing before Ghislaine, she greeted him. But when Alfoy grumbled about her slowness, Ghislaine then told her to drop everything and come to him. Alfoy told Ghislaine to let it go. Before he could even finish, the impact sent him sprawling to the ground. Alfoy, furious, Ghislaine retorted that Vanessa no longer belonged to the bathhouse. He was ready to overlook that, but absolutely forbade Vanessa from being bothered any further. Seeing this, the girl flushed slightly with embarrassment. Alfoy was absolutely livid at being treated this way. He demanded how Ghislaine dared treat a third-class mage and heir to the tower like that. He believed the aristocrat had crossed a line and was ready to throw down. Ghislaine clicked his tongue in annoyance and snapped his fingers. Instantly, all the mercenaries drew their weapons. The mages were outraged that they had a contract so Ghislaine could do whatever he pleased with him. Alfoy was seething but had no retort. Ghislaine said that if Alfoy wanted respect, he'd have to earn it. But Alfoy bristled at the words that he was merely a reserve unit. As he left, Ghislaine ordered his men to show Alfoy how everything worked. Kaor chuckled, remarking that life must be easier in the tower. Seeing two burly mercenaries before him, Alfoy felt a chill of fear. Vanessa watched from the sidelines with almost complete indifference. Ghislaine then approached her. Vanessa was flustered by his words. She then looked away, remembering she didn't know how to do magic. With a slight smile, Ghislaine simply told her to follow him. He promised to help the girl unlock her potential. Soon they arrived at the training area. The girl glanced around indifferently, and Ghislaine turned to her. He asked about the depth of her knowledge, and it turned out she had studied up to the 5th circle. Ghislaine was genuinely impressed. Vanessa looked at him silently for a moment, then admitted she couldn't use spells anyway. Ghislaine asked if there was a reason for this. Eventually, her teacher passed away. She believed that was the reason for her expulsion. Ghislaine remained silent. The 5th circle was comparable in power to the Tower Elder's abilities. In magic, Vanessa understood this, but her body couldn't keep up with her mind. But Vanessa's efforts weren't all for nothing. She just had to follow a different path. He remembered Claude's words about Vanessa. The man thought she was simply crazy. But now Ghislaine wanted to teach the girl mana cultivation. She was surprised to hear this, not understanding why she needed to cultivate. But Ghislaine said everything was interconnected, and she hadn't even tried this approach. Suddenly, she got scared, saying that doing magic like that was pure madness. But Ghislaine asked her to at least try. At that instant, their gazes met. Vanessa then pondered his proposal, wondering if she could actually do magic. Then she clenched her fist tightly. Up until now, she'd failed at everything. Ghislaine thought he'd seen those same eyes in his past life. Filled with regret, she yearned for magic, but only sank deeper into the abyss. But now Ghislaine knew how to help her, and he wouldn't let her fall into that abyss again. He wanted to reach out to her. Ghislaine managed to transfer his mana into Vanessa's body. The girl, however, felt a warmth spread through her body. Ghislaine told her not to open her mouth, or she'd interrupt the mana flow. He said his mana was inside her, then, capturing every corner and returning mana to her core. The entire room was bathed in a powerful light. Suddenly, Vanessa remembered something. She remembered how her teacher had defended her, but the Lord replied that she lacked something, asking what kind of mage she was if she couldn't even cast a spell. The bishop believed that no matter how much they spent on Vanessa, it would be useless. Vanessa recognized her younger self, and suddenly, another memory with her teacher flashed through her mind. She said if she'd been more talented, her teacher wouldn't have had to leave the tower. But her teacher said she was just going on a trip, asking her not to be upset. He said no darkness in the world lasts forever, promising that one day the truth would come to light. And that light turned out to be Ghislaine. Then she realized that the teacher was right. Finally, someone reached out to her, and she could finally bask in some sunlight. Some noise could be heard from one of the houses. A brawl had broken out between several travelers inside. One of them provoked his opponents, and they fell for the taunts, attacking him. But that warrior easily dodged the sword blows. Just then, but he quickly noticed that too. Holding the first by the hand, he flung him aside and took down the second warrior. They were thrown back with such force they ripped a hole in the building. He chuckled as he said he hadn't even had time to warm up yet. Others laughed, saying some worms were getting in the way of their feast, and everyone agreed, so no one could stop them now. Another friend of theirs was fishing outside. They asked if his training had gone well, but he just asked for what was needed. Then the man said there was an order from Desmond. Upon hearing that, he then took off his helmet, and as he put it on, he prepared to leave on a mission. He added that it was a boring place anyway. Meanwhile, the news reached the lands of Pertium, and Ghislaine's father looked grim. He received a letter informing him that Ghislaine had killed Gilmore Degrad, and they would seek revenge. The man then ordered the soldiers to be summoned, but the man was outraged by this accusation. Everyone thought they were trying to start a war out of thin air, but the Lord continued trying to keep up appearances. Suddenly he heard that the people needed a stone. Ghislaine was sure the vassals had leaked information about the changes, but others were outraged by their vassals' betrayal. The Lord mused that sometimes, even doing the right thing for the land could lead to ruin. But it seemed Ghislaine was already expecting this. The knight declared they had more forces and lands than the Degrads, but then someone cut their visit short. Scoven had more news to deliver. He informed everyone. Right then, after scaling the wall, the Lord suspected a conspiracy, as the enemies appeared right after the declaration of war. Next, they reported the troop numbers and their weaponry. But the power gap was so massive, everyone started to panic. Then Lord Pertium snapped everyone back to reality. He declared their bickering was stealing precious time they needed to defend themselves. civilians were evacuated immediately. Then he had to announce the war had begun. As he approached the castle, he mused that his son had no talent, but his death allowed the war to commence. Count Degrad was impressed by the castle, and then Pertium then turned to his brother, demanding to know what was going on. But Degrad declared his son had been killed on these very lands. What's more, he was slain by Pertium's own son. He offered Pertium a surrender, promising no bloodshed. Gislen watched in silence. At that, the lords were outraged by the unfolding events. Gislen understood such an outcome was unavoidable, and since they'd brought siege weapons, they intended to destroy them. Suddenly, he heard that his father was defending Gislen's son, and that was Pertium's final answer. That tone alarmed Degrad for an instant. Sam was impressed by the Grand General's imposing presence. Degrad, too, expected no less from the Wolf of the North. Then he turned and told Pertium not to regret it. Standing by the wall, everyone heard Degrad's distant laughter. Then the knight asked for orders, but others dissuaded them from fighting. The lords protested vehemently, but Pertium remained silent. Chaos muddled his thoughts. Suddenly, the war began, and the enemy proved ready. He didn't know what to do in that moment. Then Gislen told them to prepare for a siege. His father looked at him surprised. Gislen asserted the power difference was more than double, and once the siege weapon was ready, the enemy would attack with full force. Gislen stated their best option was to call for aid and resist. His father replied that even if that were the case, what to do next wasn't clear. This made Gislen let out a discreet chuckle, and he whispered something to his father. He didn't reply, only staring at his son, surprised. Gislen was betting everything on a radical shift in the situation. He decided to discuss what to do with his people. However, Jillian was out of ideas. Kaor, too, was deep in thought. Belinda couldn't believe the war had actually begun. Then Gislen decided to lay out their course of action. Gislen decided to strike at the enemy's supplies before it was too late, but Belinda questioned how they could do that, with so many eyes fixed on the castle. Gislen then turned to Kaor and Gillian. Kaor reported that, as Gislen requested, they had positioned troops in the forest in advance, and the Entidiros bark cloaks they'd requested were already prepared. Gislen asserted that small camouflaged units could easily carry out sabotage, but he told Belinda they didn't know where the supplies were stored, and he needed her to scout out their situation. The girl was surprised by the task. Infiltrating enemy ranks was dangerous, but Gislen trusted Belinda to handle it. Now, only one small thing remained: to play a trump card that would end the war. A few days later, the supply camp was located in the rear, and the commanders were pleased with its position. One of them was thrilled to soon receive a share of those lands. Then someone started approaching the camp, and they arrived right on schedule. Everyone noticed it was cloudy and impossible to see anything. Gislen agreed everything was perfect for the attack. He ordered them to take no prisoners and kill everyone. Soon, before the guards even had time to react, knights charged them and were instantly cut down. The remaining soldiers in the camp immediately prepared for battle, but before they could do anything, they were slaughtered. Then Gislen roared again that they shouldn't bother with formalities against their opponents. The Baron was then informed they were under attack. The Baron told them not to worry, as they had 1,000 fighters. However, the other man was disheartened by these words. Gislen's squad dealt with the enemies mercilessly. This left the man tense. After a moment's thought, but then his comrade was attacked. Startled, the man collapsed to the ground. Belinda immediately recognized Pablo's vassal. The vassal was terrified to see the girl. Soon, everything was ablaze. Belinda reported that Pablo not only leaked the information, but also led the group. The man then began to beg for mercy. Gislen demanded to know who bribed him. The man immediately said it was Desmond, but also threatened him. Gislen was then convinced that Desmond had handed the army over to the Degrads. Meanwhile, the man kept trying to curry favor with Gislen. Dismounting his horse, the man then became overjoyed and thanked him for the opportunity. But without a word, Gislen lopped off his head. The man didn't even have time to understand what had happened, and Gislen refused to make a deal with him. After all, he believed traitors deserved nothing but death. After setting the enemy camp ablaze, they prepared to return. Belinda looked at Gislen. Gislen had received orders to return to the castle. After all, it was highly probable they had already begun their attack, and attacking from the rear would destabilize their formation. He assigned the left flank to Kaor and Belinda, keeping the right for himself. Then he turned to Jillian and entrusted the enemy base to him. The man agreed to take on the task without any issue. Belinda asked who would be in charge of the main gate. No one understood his reply. Then, in silence, he turned to his comrades and smiled, declaring that this war would open a new chapter in their history. Lord Pertium ordered them to prepare for the attack. The crossbowmen moved to the wall and tried to target the enemy. However, they had already scaled the walls. There were too many enemies, so everyone engaged in close quarters combat. As the battle raged, he decided the battle's outcome was already set. Sam also believed this was the end for the North. At first, he doubted, but now, as he watched, After all, Pertium had reached a dead end. Then someone said the gates would fall soon too, but the Lord told them to forget the gate and keep defending the wall. Scoven reported there would be no reinforcements, as they already had enough problems. It was a shame no one was willing to support them. Suddenly, they were about to report something to Degrad. The soldier said their supplies had run out. The supply detachment hadn't returned yet, so they presumed something had happened. Degrad was surprised that Pertium had managed to locate the supply camp. Moreover, smoke was rising from the camp, and that even piqued his interest. Degrad demanded what they should do, seeing as they were out of supplies. But Sam just slapped his face, declaring supplies were no longer necessary. Degrad was stunned by his words. By day's end, the castle would be theirs. Sam silently turned towards the castle. He was a seasoned veteran. The flank attack had already begun, but the walls still held strong. But the central gates? No one was guarding them. Suddenly, it all clicked. He sent every last soldier to charge. He commanded them, breach the central gate. He stayed put for a moment and called one of his fighters. When Iden stepped forward, but they should have stayed, held their ground. Still, they kept scaling the wall. Pertium, meanwhile, kept slaughtering soldiers. Then Scoven alerted his lord to something. It turned out siege towers were rolling towards them. To their dismay, the towers were the exact same height as the walls. Pertium immediately ordered the catapults prepared. Their setup had just finished. They immediately began firing, desperate to stop the towers from reaching the walls. The enemy watched as the metal projectile flew, but before it could hit, someone smashed it down. Pertium was aghast. They didn't immediately recognize him, but then Pertium saw that knight. Staring, he couldn't believe it was Sam. Sam declared Pertium's downfall was inevitable. Then he ordered the battering ram brought out, and everyone aimed for the gate. After scaling the tower, warriors stormed onto the castle wall. In the heat of battle, several soldiers were positioned at the gate, standing guard. Meanwhile, the mages were tied up. Alfoy furiously demanded their release, refusing to surrender their lives, but the knight ordered them to silence. Alfoy protested, arguing that letting the battering ram get this close meant certain death. Despite his shouts, Vanessa stayed calm. She told him not to worry, promising Ghislaine would handle everything. But Alfoy didn't believe her. The more she tried to soothe him, the more enraged Alfoy became. Vanessa calmly stated Ghislaine was trustworthy. Just days ago, he'd taught her magic. However, very little of it had been revealed. Vanessa was embarrassed and apologized, but Ghislaine encouraged her. Then he called her outside and showed her something. It turned out some construction was underway there. Vanessa didn't understand why they'd buried the runic stone. Just then, Alfoy suddenly approached, demanding to know why Ghislaine was making them dig. Then Gordon intervened. Vanessa was taken aback by all of it, but Ghislaine explained this was preparation. He understood that in this battle the gates would still fall, yet he still believed they could win. Vanessa listened, and then it clicked. She guessed what Ghislaine was planning. Truth be told, she wasn't sure she could handle it. Nevertheless, Ghislaine had immense expectations for her. Vanessa focused her power into the center of that magic circle, making Alfoy wonder if it was a mana transfer circle. Completely focused, the mage recalled Ghislaine's words. She could do this. Would. Meanwhile, the sound of battle echoed against the gate, until Randolph spotted something in the distance. A unit was approaching. Oswald immediately recognized his son leading the elite troop. At that very moment, a messenger rushed to Victor with an urgent report. There was a surprise attack from an unknown unit coming from two different directions. It was Kaur and Belinda attacking from one flank, and Ghislaine from the other. The enemy soldiers, caught completely off guard, tried to react, but their efforts against Ghislaine were futile. Alone, while many called him a monster, Ghislaine ordered Pertium's soldiers to rise. The time for a counterattack had come, and the plan was working perfectly. They had surrounded the invaders in their own territory. Simultaneously, at the Degrad base, he declared he would hold the front line and ordered Gordon and Thorin to attack from the flanks, destroying the enemy camp's structure. The mercenaries' loyalty to Ghislaine proved unwavering. Count Degrad, utterly stunned, questioning how they'd managed to organize such an attack while his knights desperately tried to escort him to safety. But Gillian advanced relentlessly. Axe in hand, he declared that this was the enemy leader and he would be taken prisoner. However, one of the elite knights blocked his strike. Gillian immediately realized this opponent was no ordinary soldier. The Lancer praised their courage for launching an attack with such reduced numbers, demanding to know Gillian's name before the duel. But the mercenary coldly replied there was no need for introductions. Meanwhile, on the west wall, she trapped them with her mana threads, while Kaur finished them off. Belinda, annoyed, asked if there was really a need to get her so dirty, to which he replied she just needed to dodge, because they couldn't stop now. On the east wall, Ghislain decimated the enemy ranks. They would exploit the invaders' panic to ensure everyone fell that day. One of the Count's commanders yelled, outraged, asking how his soldiers dared turn their backs on the battle. Lancers turned to block Ghislain's path, who whispered to his horse that it would be best to dodge, and the animal obeyed, dodging all the spears with supernatural agility. The soldiers were so shocked they didn't even see Ghislain's attack coming. He applied a leg lock to the first soldier's neck and used him as a base for a devastating circular strike, knocking everyone around him down, decapitating them or splitting them in half. However, Ghislain realized the situation on the wall was worse than he'd imagined. At this rate, the defenses would fall before they could open the gate. Even with the pressure they were exerting, the enemy's numerical superiority was still dangerous. One misstep, the enemy commander roared for Ghislain to be stopped. Now, screaming they couldn't let him advance another inch. Ghislain knew his time was running out. Before the wall crumbled, he had to end this. Channeling aura into his massive blade, he decapitated the first soldier in a flash. The second dropped with a gaping wound in his chest, and the third didn't even see death coming. Ducking a hail of arrows, Ghislain skewered the commander with his blade. Then, using the weapon as a grappling hook to launch himself to the top of the wall, the enemy army's grand captain, Victor, impressed he'd taken down the entire camp single-handedly. The gate, however, still held strong. A soldier reported the gate's defenses were tougher than expected, estimating another 10 minutes to breach it. But Victor demanded it be done in 5. Meanwhile, he'd personally handle the enemy captain, threatening to kill his own men if they failed. Kaur, however, intervened, declaring Victor wasn't going anywhere because the mercenary leader wanted to play with him. Victor proved to be incredibly seasoned. His first move was to have his horse deliver a brutal kick to Kaur's steed, killing the animal instantly and throwing the mercenary off balance. But the king of mercenaries was quick enough to dodge. He was, however, stunned when Victor blocked every single one of his attacks with pinpoint precision. Victor scoffed, mercenaries who thought they were strong. The captain's next blow didn't just push Kaur back. It shattered his blade in half and struck him squarely. The captain sneered. Kaur realized Victor's strength was real, confirming Ghislain's warning. Ghislain had warned him. His name was Victor, the Degrad family's ace in the hole, a warrior more powerful than anyone Ghislain had ever met, except for Ghislain himself. Victor would use his overwhelming force to smash through the wall's defenses, exactly as planned. But if he decided to abandon the gate, Pertium's plan would crumble. That's why Kaur couldn't give up. His only mission was to hold Victor back. With a defiant grin, Kaur admitted this was one hell of a cursed mission. Across the battlefield, engaged in the duel, Adam couldn't lead his soldiers effectively. Jillian was starting to get frustrated. They couldn't hesitate any longer, but Adam's heavy shield absorbed every single one of his blows. He couldn't remember the last time he'd faced such an impenetrable defense. Seizing an opening, Adam managed to land a decisive blow, pinning Jillian to the ground with his shield. At that very moment, the enemies managed to breach Pertium's gates. Vanessa had already siphoned all the mana from the exhausted mage and declared she needed just a bit more. Victor announced the gates were open and ordered all units to attack immediately. He commanded Count Degrad be brought forward, taking full command of the invasion, but Kaur cut in. Not yet. He wouldn't let Victor leave. The enemy captain questioned why the mercenary leader would risk his life for no apparent reason, now that defeat was imminent. Meanwhile, Adam told Jillian the gate was open and they had lost. He conceded they were blindsided by the rear attack, but that the final outcome would be the same. Pertium's mistake was thinking they could fill the power gap with mercenaries who would never be a match for elite knights. Both Victor and Adam severely underestimated the mercenaries. Kaur stood up, stating it mattered little whether they were mercenaries or knights. Jillian finished his thought, declaring that the only thing that mattered in battle was to win or die. Adam retorted there was no point talking to an animal, but as he lunged with his spear, thrown to the ground, Adam incredulously asked how he dared call himself merely a mercenary, as he desperately blocked the axe threatening to cleave him in two. Jillian replied that no matter how good the defense, there would always be an opening. His only purpose in life now was to be one of the young master's swords. Then, meanwhile, Kaur pondered Victor's monstrous strength. He couldn't die there. He recalled a conversation with Ghislain, where he had asked how the young master had won that bet. Ghislain had taught him that the most important part wasn't the movement itself, but understanding what the opponent was thinking. You had to know how the enemy expected you to move. Victor commented that Kaur looked like a wild animal attacking like that. Ghislain had said the enemy would always underestimate him. In that moment, Kaur's movements became so unpredictable, a dagger throw. Victor sneered, claiming that fools like Kaur believed they had nothing to lose and made reckless decisions, which usually led to death. Staring death in the face. If you can hide your true intentions until the right moment, and that's exactly what Kaur did. He grabbed Victor's arm, using the enemy's armor weight as leverage not to hit Victor. Victor thought using his sword to gain momentum in midair was completely unexpected. Even in that desperate situation, the mercenary had still managed to formulate a strategy, something only someone prepared for death could do. The captain admitted Kaur wasn't just a wild beast. He had talent. It was common to push past limits when facing life or death. Victor regretted knowing him for such a short time and admitted he'd misjudged him, granting him the right to his last words. Kaur, with a smirk, Victor was almost hit by Belinda's attacks as she launched her threads, pulling Kaur away from the captain's deadly reach. All of that was to buy time, and they had succeeded. Victor realized the attack was surprising, and if it weren't for the woman, Kaur wouldn't be foolish enough to trade his life for a single blow without a bigger reason. This meant there was a bigger plan. Victor suddenly understood that if he didn't get inside the gates in time, something terrible would happen. He saw Vanessa concentrating immense power. Vanessa had a simple plan given by Ghislaine. When the enemies broke through the main gate and crowded the entrance, they would turn the tables using her magic. She had asked if she could do it, and Ghislaine had replied that he trusted her. The magic circle radiated so much mana that, even before being hit, a colossal explosion of fire swept through the entrance, even those who hadn't even entered the castle yet. The sight on the horizon was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The surviving soldiers desperately tried to flee death, getting carbonized in the process, but Ghislaine intercepted those who tried to escape, ordering his forces to surround the gate immediately. No invader would leave alive. Victor, watching the flames, most of the troops were being burned alive. The captain found it infuriating. They had meticulously planned that war for years, predicting all of Pertium's escape routes. And yet, his men, that mercenary, and a mage capable of incinerating hundreds of soldiers in an instant had ruined everything. It was too much of a coincidence to be true. Victor concluded they had fallen into a trap. He ordered a retreat to regroup, believing that outside the forest it would be easy to reorganize their forces. But when he sent for Adam, he saw his subordinate's head being carried by Jillian. The mercenary announced that they had already destroyed Adam's troops and base, and that it was time for Victor to surrender. Victor refused to accept that the war would end that way. He swore he would give his all to rip off Jillian's head too. This was now his personal war. Meanwhile, Pertium's forces counterattacked, cutting off Degrad's soldiers from escaping. Ghislaine declared this was their chance to turn the tide. Belinda appeared. Ghislaine said he was fine. A thumbs up from the mercenary confirmed he'd survive. Belinda commented that if they'd waited any longer, he would have died, admitting she'd thought the plan was idiotic at first. But Ghislaine pointed out that it had worked. Belinda swore she'd never do something like that again, reminding him they only pulled it off thanks to the accumulated crystals. When Ghislaine asked about Jillian, this made the young master leave immediately, because Jillian was facing Victor himself. Victor's blows were so heavy, he was, without a doubt, the enemy army's most powerful warrior, combining brute strength and speed. A blow sliced Jillian's shoulder. The mercenary admitted the enemy's superiority, unable to find an opening. Victor scoffed, calling him a damned mercenary. Without difficulty, Victor hooked his blade into Jillian's axe. The next blow would decide the fight. Despite being impaled, Jillian avoided death at the last instant, deflecting just enough to protect his vital organs. Victor recognized his tenacity, understanding how he'd managed to kill Adam. No one had withstood his attacks for so long, but Victor considered it foolish for Jillian to have wasted energy on Adam only to face him afterward. He declared that if Adam had died by the mercenary's hands, but now it was Jillian's turn. Victor's final attack was interrupted by a great sword hurled in his direction. It was Ghislaine. Jillian was relieved he'd held on until that moment, creating the opening for his master's arrival. Ghislaine wielded the fallen axe. Victor recognized the young man's black armor. Ghislaine activated his mana core's overload, charging forward like an enraged beast. His blow almost shattered Victor's defenses, who narrowly countered. They traded blows at breakneck speed. Even an aerial attack from Victor was blocked by Ghislaine. Caught by surprise, he didn't expect such skill. At this rate, he'd die. Victor didn't know such talented people existed in Pertium. Ghislaine revealed he knew him very well. His strength, his strategy, and even how he'd commanded a secret elite battalion. He knew everything. Realizing he was cornered, Victor did the only thing possible. He attacked with everything he had. He couldn't believe someone from Pertium knew so much about him. As Ghislaine struck with the axe, on the verge of getting his neck sliced, it was a deadly dance. A kick from Gizlan threw Victor off balance. Ghislaine sauntered closer, remarking that while he appreciated the axe, he was far more suited to wielding such a weapon. Victor snarled, "Who the hell are you?" The youth simply introduced himself, the next in line for the Pertium succession. Victor scoffed in disbelief. The great knight of the north was being pushed around by some punk kid. Ghislaine confirmed it, promising to show him who the real best knight of the north was. Victor took the bait, choosing not to question how the kid had orchestrated all this. In war, you use every trick to win. All that matters is being the last one standing. He channeled every last bit of aura left in his body. Ghislaine nodded, then activated his next mana core and lunged for the final attack. As the Pertium family reclaimed their territory, the final showdown raged amidst the flames. Blades clashed with furious intensity. Victor's technique was precise, but Ghislaine was faster, more agile, and full of dirty tricks. Scrambling onto his opponent's armor, Ghislaine delivered a brutal kick to Victor's face, sending him sprawling. The captain still managed to land a minor wound on Ghislaine, but the youth dodged it. It was a battle of both brawn and wits. If victory hinged solely on determination, Victor wouldn't stand a chance. Ghislaine seized him by the neck and hurled him away, not giving him a moment to breathe, even resorting to dirty tricks, like throwing sand in his eyes. In his previous life, it was Victor who had appeared to stop him. After numerous clashes in that other life, Ghislaine had finally killed him, but it had taken too long, allowing more enemies to rise and destroy the Pertium family. Now his resolve was set. Anyone who dared to threaten his family would face only one outcome: death. His strike ran Victor through. With his dying breath, the captain gasped out, asking again who the hell this kid was. Ghislaine replied that the Ghislaine Victor knew, or expected to know, was nothing but human trash, but that version no longer existed. He admitted the fight had been fun. Ultimately, the Pertium family triumphed. Ghislaine and Jillian returned, wounded but alive. Everyone waited with bated breath. When Ghislaine asked if everyone had survived, his men rushed to him, cheering his incredible leadership. They'd never seen a war like that before. Ghislaine thanked them for their support. Kaior joked, asking if old man Jillian was throwing himself at the captain over a little scratch, to which the mercenary replied it was nothing. Belinda warned that they were bleeding heavily. She explained that Vanessa had fainted from exhaustion, just like the other mages. Randolph hugged Ghislaine, but the young man's real concern was for his father. Lord Pertium approached in silence and hugged his son, telling him he'd done a great job. He admitted that when he first heard the plan, he thought it was utterly ridiculous, but it had worked, and that's what mattered. Ghislaine humbly replied that the plan only worked because his father had protected the walls, but Lord Pertium denied it, insisting it was all thanks to his son. Raising Ghislaine's arm, he proclaimed Pertium's victory, and the celebration was immense. Ghislaine, however, thought that even though they had won the battle, the fight wasn't over yet. Desmond had to fall. Randolph asked what the next steps were. Lord Pertium ordered Ghislaine to gather his men too, as they would have a lot of work ahead, but for now it was time to rest. Ghislaine refused. They had no time to spare. They needed Count Degrad to formally surrender. He proposed going immediately with his mercenaries to the Count's territory and asked his father to grant him authority as substitute lord. Lord Pertium argued that the war had just ended, and Ghislaine and his men must be exhausted, so there was no need for such haste. But Ghislaine insisted the war wasn't over yet. It was Count Degrad who cut ties and started the conflict. They couldn't give the enemy time, or they would come back again. Lord Pertium reflected and agreed. He authorized their departure, but asked Ghislaine not to forget that Count Degrad had once been an ally, requesting that he at least receive him politely. Ghislaine told him not to worry about it. He asked if Kaur and Belinda could still move, and when they confirmed, he ordered them to accompany him. They set off at maximum speed for Degrad County. There, the white flag was already raised. Count Degrad wondered, incredulous, how this had happened. They had planned everything in secret with Desmond's help, and still lost to those damned Pertiums. He ordered his servant to begin preparations for negotiations, planning to offer compensation. He believed that the Lord of Pertium, being a man of honor, would easily accept, giving them time to get out of the crisis and pin the blame on Desmond. The subordinate questioned where they would get the money, as they had spent so much on the war. The Count grabbed him by the neck, furious, reminding him that they just needed to squeeze the people. For him, his own importance surpassed that of those pigs living in the mud. He slammed his subordinate to the ground, barking orders to get moving. The servant, forced to toil under such harsh conditions, feared an internal rebellion brewing. Suddenly, a soldier arrived with bad news. Pertium's forces were already on their land, ready to negotiate. The Count thought they'd arrived way too fast, completely messing up his plans. Still, thinking he'd at least be dealing with Pertium's lord. But when Ghislaine strode into the room, asking if they were ready to surrender, the Count demanded to know why he was here, and not his father, and not Ghislain coldly retorted that his father was busy rebuilding everything the Count had destroyed. That's why he had come as the temporary substitute lord to negotiate. Hours earlier, on their way, Kaur had scoffed that fat Degrad guy had scurried home, questioning what kind of leader abandoned his subordinates and fled like a rat. Ghislain thought about checking the details with Gillian later. Kaur asked if they'd actually leave the Count alive during negotiations. Ghislain explained that while Count Degrad had tried to wipe out Pertium, simply killing him could put them in a tough political spot, especially since the war's root cause was his son's death. Kaur grumbled that he was overcomplicating things and just suggested they attack and seize the territory. Belinda shot back that mercenaries weren't nobles, and not everything could be solved with a brawl. Kaur argued that everyone was human, so why did nobles have to be different? On the battlefield, Ghislain told them not to worry. He was just quoting what his father would do. He, Degrad, was theirs now. Back in the present, Ghislain ordered the Count removed from his presence immediately. The noble was literally carried out, screaming for them to take their dirty hands off him. Belinda asked if they could really do that, and Ghislain confirmed it. The Count protested, but Ghislain threatened him with his sword, branding him a traitor blinded by greed and declaring that for Pertium's enemies. The Count, terrified, Ghislain replied that since he'd risked so many lives in the war, it was only fair he put his own on the line as well. Realizing the crazy kid was actually going to kill him, the Count begged him to wait. He agreed to pay a fair price and offered his territory. Everyone was shocked. Ghislain thought it was obvious he'd prefer that over dying. He remembered that, by law, inheriting territory required blood ties to the current owner. It wasn't something that could just be given away. The Count promised to find a way, suggesting they invent a story that Ghislain was a distant nephew. He yelled at his subordinate to get paper and pen immediately. The Count kept begging, offering financial compensation if Ghislain would just wait a bit, pleading for mercy. Ghislain asked if his life was that precious by simply expelling him from his own territory. The people of Degrad watched confused as the Count was thrown to the ground. The noble questioned why he was out there with those disgusting commoners. Ghislain warned him to watch his words, because now he depended on those very people to survive. So Ghislain made an announcement to the people. He introduced himself as Ghislain Pertium and explained that the Count had declared war, claiming his son's death, but had lost. Now the Count wanted to pay his debt with the people's hard-earned money. Ghislain asked if anyone wished to help him. The people indignantly replied no. Too much had already been taken from them. They said that as a noble, he could very well take care of himself. Ghislain, representing Pertium's leader, they could save the Count by paying his debts. The Count demanded how they dared humiliate him like this. In response, the people began pelting him with stones, shouting that he had stolen even the children's bread. Many people suffered because of him. And just like that, the Count was lynched by the people of his own former territory. Ghislain declared that the war was finally over. He mentioned his father to Belinda, who understood he had other plans. Later at Pertium Castle, Lord Pertium, shocked, Ghislain confirmed that Count Degrad was dead. His father asked if he had forgotten the order to show respect. Ghislain replied that he hadn't forgotten, but had acted according to the situation. If they gave the Count a chance, he would attack again. Degrad had already attacked Pertium with 7,000 men, a force that obviously wasn't just his. Desmond had supplied the army, and Leopold had helped lead it. Those present in the room said that was impossible. Homer asked if it was because of that matter. Ghislain thought that for sure, probably killing the messengers. But now that they had taken Degrad's territory, the story had changed. They didn't have a direct line to Pertium's territory. Lord Pertium accepted, but questioned how Ghislain intended to take possession of the territory without a bloodline. Ghislain asked him to look at the document he'd acquired. It stated that Ghislain was a distant nephew and the sole heir to Degrad's territory. This would avoid problems with the possession. Lord Pertium warned that commanding a territory wasn't easy, and asked if Ghislain thought he was capable of using the current resources. His son replied not to worry, as he had the perfect person for the job. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Seiren, a man was playing dice, trying to cheat. His opponent asked if he knew what happened to cheaters. Claude replied to take it easy, as they were just having fun. Later, Ghislain was receiving his honors. Lord Pertium recognized his achievements and, in his majesty's name, bestowed upon him the title of Baron of Fenrris. Everyone cheered. Long live the Baron. Moments before, Ghislain had indicated on the map that the county of Degrad was comprised of 5 baronial territories. He planned to stay in the center of it all. No one had any doubts. Lord Pertium allowed him to do as he pleased, praising his work. He mentioned that the territory was facing financial difficulties due to the war and was thinking of selling magic crystals. Ghislain warned that none were left, as they had all exploded at the gate, but promised to get more. After receiving the title, Belinda suggested they celebrate. Gillian congratulated his young master, correcting himself to call him Baron. Kaur commented that the boy was growing up. Belinda remembered wondering what he would be like when he grew up, and said it seemed she had raised him very well. Kaur teased that was why he was so spoiled. Belinda cheered for the incredible title. Helena appeared carrying someone and declared she'd now call him Lord Ghislain, no longer brother. He waved off the formality. Ghislain noticed she was carrying Rachel and asked the girl how she was doing. Rachel spoke without formalities, and Ghislain said if Helena bothered her, she could speak up or even hit her sister. Ghislain commented to Jillian that his daughter looked much better. Ghislain got everyone's attention. He announced that their base would no longer be in Pertium. They would stop being mere mercenaries and become part of his army, trained to be knights, as they deserved this honor for the courage they'd shown. Belinda worried about the costs, but Ghislain said that's exactly why they needed to push themselves. He informed them that Jillian, now fully recovered, would lead the men of Fenrris. Jillian asked if his master wouldn't be joining him. Ghislain replied, "Not for now. I need to stop somewhere first." Since the war was over, the people's safety had deteriorated, and he would personally take care of it. He declared that Jillian was the person he trusted most. Jillian, shocked and deeply moved, Ghislain informed them that Belinda and Kaur would accompany him to Austin territory in the kingdom of Seiron. Belinda perked up at the thought of a trip to another kingdom. Kaur asked if the territory wasn't famous for gambling and if they could play a bit. Ghislain shut down the excitement, warning that they weren't going on a pleasure trip. Meanwhile, Vanessa was practically begging Alfoy to drain just a little more of his mana to test some spells. The mage desperately refused. Vanessa argued that the master himself had said he was a wellspring of mana. Ghislain appeared, commenting on the morning's lively commotion. Alfoy cried for help, whining that Vanessa was trying to rob him blind. But Ghislain only worried about her, asking if she was feeling better after her first real battle. Alfoy indignantly asked if he was just going to be ignored. Ghislain praised his efforts too, saying it was good to see him actually working for once. Alfoy grumbled that he just wanted to go back to his tower. Ghislain replied that he could come along on the trip. Later, in Austin Territory's bustling gaming hall, Alfoy asked if they weren't supposed to be heading to the magic tower. Ghislain simply said they could have some fun. Kaur, with a wicked grin, provoked Alfoy, saying he knew how to use magic, but didn't understand how the world worked. They'd use money to make even more money. Belinda asked if Ghislain had come to have fun too. He denied it. He had come to recruit someone for his territory. He explained that the target lived in the gaming hall for a complicated reason, and that he needed to get him out of there before something bad happened. Belinda found it odd to recruit someone here. Ghislain said he didn't have many other options, but assured her he wasn't that bad. His name was Claude. Suddenly, someone yelled, accusing him of being up to no good again just because he'd studied at the academy. They were ready to chop off his hand. The bald man, the owner of the place, said he'd warned him to be careful, accusing him of swapping out the dice to cheat the regulars. Claude denied it, saying he'd never touched the hall's dice and that, besides cheating, they were making a fool out of him. The bald guy retorted that it didn't make a difference and told him not to get butthurt, they were just too different. But just then, a hand shot out, stopping Claude's hand from being severed. It was Ghislain, declaring this game looked, and he wanted in. He introduced himself as Ghislain from the kingdom of Ludania, the current baron of Fenrris. The bald guy immediately questioned the presence of a foreign noble. His guards lunged, but the owner instantly barked for them to stop. He then asked why a noble would grace such a filthy place with his presence. Ghislain replied that he was looking for someone who was right there, then ordered Claude to get up because he'd come to take him away. Meanwhile, Kaur and Alfoy were deep in their game. The wizard had racked up 1,000 points. All the luck at the table was squarely on his side. Kaur was thoroughly impressed by Alfoy's uncanny gift. Alfoy mused that even selling scrolls all day wouldn't net him this much cash. His heart had never pounded so hard. Just then, a commotion erupted from upstairs. Belinda asked if that was the man they'd come for. The bald guy replied he was sorry, but taking him would be difficult. All his players were sacred. He had to pay up. Ghislain then asked Claude if he was cheating. Claude, seizing the opportunity, profusely apologized to the Baron. He explained they conducted constant inspections, but just as he was winning, a modified die mysteriously appeared, and they pinned the blame on him. Belinda was outraged. Ghislain asked if it was true. The bald guy retorted that their relationship didn't matter. He wanted to know if he could trust the words of a cheater. He warned that even as a noble, Ghislain could face diplomatic problems if he got involved. He suggested Ghislain pretend he hadn't seen a thing and just leave. Ghislain flat out refused. He proposed resolving everything with a simple agreement. They would play. If Ghislain won, he'd get his money and Claude back. If he lost, everyone was stunned. Belinda gasped, asking if he was insane. Claude thanked him for the help. Ghislain insisted he needed him no matter the cost. The bald guy commented that it had been ages since he'd seen such a courageous noble and accepted the challenge. If you step into this casino, you have to play. Tension gripped the entire venue, and a murmur spread like wildfire. A noble was challenging the boss. The rules were simple. Whoever rolled the lowest number on the dice, in case of a tie, they'd play again until a winner emerged. They knew modern nobles detested complications. Gislen agreed. He chose heads and Crank tails. Crank won and rolled the first die, creating an entire ceremony with exaggerated theatrical movements. Finally, he placed the die on the table and scored a single point. It was impossible to roll a number lower than 1. The crowd immediately murmured that the rich boy had already lost. Belinda and Claude were visibly distraught. Crank scoffed, claiming luck was with him, but Gislen shushed him. Crank knew it was just a bluff. The noble could hide his emotions all he wanted, but he was surely dying of anxiety, because everything he did would be useless. Of course, Crank had cheated. He used a special cup whose bottom opened depending on how it was held, allowing a modified die to be inserted. The shaking of the cup merely served to disguise the swap. He had never been caught using this technique and would never lose. At that moment, Gislen applied so much force that he used his aura to tamper with the die itself. He casually asked if the person with the lowest number won, didn't they? Then, he crushed the die, turning it into dust. Crank asked incredulously what had happened, and the audience questioned if he had really turned the die into dust. The manager yelled that it was cheating, but Gislen grabbed his hand and asked what he was hiding there. It was the modified die. Gislen sarcastically reminded him that games were sacred and cheating wouldn't be tolerated. The manager wondered how he had found out, as a last resort, but the noble easily dodged, replying that he should have been honest from the start. Gislen criticized Crank's hypocrisy. The manager, furious, declared that the noble had barely arrived and already annoyed him, guaranteeing he wouldn't leave there alive. When the guards attacked, Gislen didn't even break a sweat. He used his own mercenaries as a springboard to reach Crank and put his sword to his neck. Boss Crank was subdued. Cower commented that they should choose better who they messed with. Belinda asked what they would do now. Gislen declared that, according to the agreement, he announced that Crank, manager and administrator of Baron Austin's main casino, had been caught trying to cheat a foreign noble. The fate of a casino that lost trust was already sealed. If they tried to reverse what happened, they would die. To emphasize the warning, however, Gislen realized that Claude had fled. Belinda was outraged. He had not only fled but also taken all the money despite them saving his arm. Cower suggested that the runaway gambler would probably hide in another casino. Belinda wanted to search the area, but Gislen said it wasn't necessary. He knew exactly where Claude had gone. Claude thought he had narrowly escaped, wondering who that noble was and why he had helped him. But that didn't matter. He had gotten the money and was leaving, as he desperately needed that amount. A year ago, he had told Anna that he discovered gambling wasn't about luck. She had asked him to stop, reminding him that the death of her father, Claude's master, but Claude insisted it was his fault. His foolishness and weakness had turned his master into a traitor. Anna Arceus, daughter of Boetios Arceus, ended up being taken as collateral. The man who took her had given Claude a year to bring 2,000 gold coins and rescue her. Now, Claude was taking the money to get her out of there. Later, at Austin Castle, the Baron was complaining as usual, ordering the execution of all prisoners crowding the jail. A knight reminded him that it had been almost a year since the traitor's daughter was captured, and asked if there was any news of Claude. The Baron replied that he had heard Claude was just wasting time in casinos without winning anything, and that Crank seemed to handle him well. He commented that if she weren't a traitor's daughter, he would even use her as a maid, but his conscience prevented him, so he ordered her executed along with the others. The knight questioned what they would do if the scoundrel actually brought the ransom. The Baron decided they would take the money and get rid of her in secret, because no one would care about a dead casino gambler. At that moment, a messenger announced Claude's arrival with the money. Claude placed the 2,000 coins on the table, stating he had brought everything accounted for and demanding Anna's immediate release. The Baron confirmed the coins were real. Claude replied that he had won it in a bet. The Baron ordered his arrest, claiming his origins were suspicious. Guards seized him. The Baron said he'd confirm with Crank and told Claude to stay quiet in his cell if he didn't want to be executed. Claude yelled it was ridiculous and swore to kill the bastard. Someone burst in, taking down 2 guards. He introduced himself as Gislen Pertium, Baron of Fenrris from the Kingdom of Ludania, and he had Crank in his custody. Gislen sat down, propped his feet on the table. A knight called him insolent and demanded respect for the Baron. Cower drew his blade, asking if they wanted to complicate things. The Baron declared he wouldn't tolerate such behavior. Gislen replied he wasn't being insolent. He just wanted compensation. He grabbed Crank's chin and explained that, almost making him and Claude lose their entire fortune at stake. Crank cried foul, accusing them of cheating, but Belinda quipped that the bald guy only knew how to lie. The Baron thought Crank, the idiot, should choose his targets better and asked what Ghislain wanted. The noble replied that in a casino, the Baron of Austin owed him and Claude fair compensation. The Baron argued he couldn't confirm Crank's innocence. Ghislain retorted that it absolutely concerned him. He threatened to spread rumors of cheating, questioning how the Baron would deal with the swindled nobles. The Baron asked if he was being blackmailed. Ghislain demanded double the amount on the table. Claude was shocked, but remained silent. Ghislain promised to consider nothing had happened if the Baron accepted. The Baron called Claude a miserable ingrate for bringing a foreign noble to rob him. Cower commented that the good part was just beginning. Belinda joked it almost looked like they'd set the whole thing up. Ghislain borrowed a dagger from Belinda. The Baron threatened to kill everyone there to erase the incident, but Ghislain was faster. He hit the Baron in the face with a money bag, while Cower and Belinda intercepted the guards. Ghislain ordered them to take them down without killing. In moments, the knights were defeated, and the Baron's personal guard was knocked out by Ghislain with a blow to the neck. Watching it all unfold, Claude wondered who these people were and why they were doing this for him. He remembered Ghislain saying he needed him at all costs, but he knew there was no kindness without reason. The wounded Baron demanded how he dared to harm a noble. Ghislain reaffirmed he'd take the money, and Anna, asking if there were any objections. Claude played along, saying if the Baron had any issues. Later, on their way back, Claude admitted he did, but he thought she'd find more peace in her homeland than by his side, the man who had caused her father's death. Ghislain thought his debt to Claude was paid. In his past life, now he was free of it. Ghislain asked what he thought of the place. Claude commented that, given the chance, he'd cut the throat of that territory's lord, as the barony looked like a dump and easy to conquer. Ghislain asked if he was suggesting he cut his own throat. Claude, surprised, asked if he was really the owner. Ghislain grabbed him by the neck and declared that and would need to pay his debt by putting everything in order. Claude tried to backtrack, but Ghislain said it was too late. Meanwhile, Desmond, watching Ghislain's plans unfold, grew increasingly furious and immediately ordered a letter sent to Amelia, accelerating their plan. Later, at Fenrris Castle, everyone gathered to begin the work. The newly liberated domain was a complete mess. Ghislain appointed Claude to various administrative roles to normalize the domain. Since they planned to plant, Claude questioned if they'd really plant in those parched fields. Ghislain confirmed, explaining they'd use the blood python's bones as fertilizer. Old facilities would be renovated, and crystal warehouses built. Claude asked if he was joking, being named administrator, supervisor, secretary. He complained about the excessive workload, but Ghislain told him to seize the chance and hire people if needed. Claude tried to escape, but Wendy, wielding threads like Belinda and sent by the housekeeper, captured him. Now she was his personal guard. Claude cried for help. In his past life, a noble had a duty to protect their inhabitants. The peasants' distrust was created by greedy nobles. Ghislain needed to solve the basics first. However, they were still broke. At this rate, in 3 months, he wouldn't even be able to pay salaries. Cower suggested selling runestones, but Ghislain explained they needed them to fund research. They needed sustainable income. Claude arrived. Belinda instructed Wendy to hit him first before letting him spout nonsense. Claude insisted they couldn't plant, an idea supported by Alfoy. Ghislain said they'd think about that later. Ghislain explained that building a casino without a stable foundation, which would be bad for facing Desmond in the future. Claude argued they wouldn't have food by then, but Ghislain guaranteed he'd solve the food problem by making everything grow in that land. Claude doubted it, as the land was infertile. Ghislain proposed a bet. 3 months later, there was a massive wheat field and food for everyone. Claude asked how he'd done it. Ghislain explained, they spread nutrient-rich blood python bone powder and planted rye strengthened with mana concentration seals, which accelerated growth by extracting power from runestones. It was a method proven by mages from the future. The people celebrated. Ghislain collected the bet from Claude and Alfoy. If they had won, they'd get 5,000 gold and freedom. Since they lost, they became unpaid slaves for 10 years. They knew they were screwed. With food secured, they could use the runestones for other purposes. Rupert, from the Magic Tower, Ghislain argued that if Fenrris were attacked again, Rupert asked why he always thought of extreme solutions. Ghislain requested more mages to establish the branch. The mages were used in major construction, digging dwellings and canals, building the Fenrris branch of the Crimson Flame Magic Tower. Although initially rebellious, Fenrris recovered rapidly. However, Claude warned of a twist in Ryfold. Amelia had begun war preparations. Ghislain thought it had happened faster than in his past life because he'd gotten involved earlier. Desmond and Amelia, Duke Delphin's puppets, Ghislain's war wasn't over. Tell me what you thought of this story. Leave a comment with a rating from 0 to 10. I'm curious to know.